Good afternoon, everyone. Today we have the honor and privilege of having Dr. Irfanullah Farooqi with us. Irfanullah Farooqi is currently working as an assistant professor, Department of Sociology, South Asian University. Prior to joining SAU, he worked at the Department of Sociology, Aligarh Muslim University, and Jamia Millia Islamia. As a result of his MPhil on Ahmad Faiz and PhD on Muhammad Iqbal, he has developed a keen interest in the meeting point of sociology, literature, and history. Currently, he finds himself inclined towards Islam and Muslims in South Asia, Urdu Studies, South Asian social thought, Sociology of Literature, and Sociology of Education. As of now, he is interested in university-nation interface, academic freedom, secular religious exchange, media culture dynamics, and questions related to identity. You're welcome, Dr. Farooqi.
Okay.
Yeah, we have up to 3 hours, but it's totally up to you and the participants how long you want to continue this session. And I request all the participants to please keep your cameras on and microphones off. You can turn on your microphones when you have to speak when we start the discussions. So, and Dr. Farooqi will be talking on dialogue and democracy today. So over to you, Dr. Farooqi.
Okay, thank you, Behzad, for this very generous introduction. Am I audible? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, I'm grateful to India Law Foundation for this opportunity. I must put on record a confession right at the outset. You see, honestly speaking, I'm not really an established scholar, a cited scholar, as it were, who works on politics in general or democracy in particular. What I'm essentially doing, or let's say what you can, is there any problem? Reza?
No.
Okay, I heard a voice. Okay, sorry. So yeah, as I was saying, that I don't happen to be, one of those cited scholars on democracy or politics in India, or politics in general. What I intend to do in the next maybe an hour or so, and of course subsequently through the Q&A or discussion as well, is I simply want to sort of initiate myself into an earnest exercise in studentship, right? So, which is kind of geared towards collaborative learning. So this is not necessarily a lecture. I would consider this as I wouldn't call them preliminary, but somewhat informed observations on dialogue, on democracy, and a possible connection between the two. So I will share thoughts and observations, for the most part, from the realm of everyday. So it would not be a quote unquote an academic, a quintessentially academic, as it were, dose till 4 o'clock. I would want to sort of tone it down a little so as to invoke a certain curiosity, so as to make a case for critical comments, suggestions, etc. So it is not really, although I happen to be an academic, but it is not going to be, technically speaking, an academic presentation or an academic lecture. I mean, of course, I will borrow from a few celebrated thinkers, people who have guided us in the most poetic, in the most prolific ways. But as I said a while ago, that need not be considered a truly, technically speaking, an academic session. So simply speaking, I am borrowing from the realm of the everyday, and the everyday is a realm that, to me, and I suppose this won't be contested. It's a very, very textured realm. It's a layered realm, and it has its own poetics, it has its own politics, its own promise, etc. So I will borrow, for the most part, from the everyday, and as I go along, I would also want you to take the plunge, as it were. There's a way in which the sequencing has been done. So the topic on which we need to sort of put our heads together is dialogue and democracy. Now, if I were to if we were to if we were to reverse the sequence, if it was democracy and dialogue, then the overall orientation of this lecture or this presentation would have been very different. But because it's sequenced a certain way, it says dialogue and democracy. There's a way in which I want to sort of look at the relationship between the two. As I don't think it is, I think we're all aware of this, that usually when we bring two ideas together, say for instance, culture and society, or literature and religion, or gender and society, what we are essentially hinting at is the fundamental relationship between these two references, these two ideas. So this theme is therefore no exception. What we are essentially trying to do is in the next hour and a half or so, is we are trying to sort of make sense of how dialogue and democracy, are connected with each other. And as I said, that I will not necessarily follow a very official academic line of inquiry. My idea is to sort of borrow from the everyday as much as I can, so that we can perhaps reflect more on these two terms separately, these two references separately, and also on the relationship or a possible relationship that I plan to sort of flag towards the end of my lecture. Uh, so this is, I thought that it was important to flag this crucial point related to the sequencing. What is also to be flagged, again, in the beginning, is that these are words that are not necessarily unfamiliar to us. I mean, these are, for the most part, I would say, these are part and parcel of our everyday vocab, right? So whether we are talking about dialogue or we are talking about democracy, there isn't any strangeness to these words, right? They are very intimate as far as what they imply, what they mean, and in various ways, in various capacities, at various points in time in our everyday life, we are engaging with these ideas, we are thinking about them, we are pondering over them, and we are also critically sort of reflecting on the possibilities they carry and the limitations or the constraints that the society in general poses on these terms or references. So what I also want to point out is that uh, there is a concern that I want to flag, that, and the concern is not to do with lack of knowledge, but the concern is to do with this idea that we know. So for instance, this is as much applicable to me as to anyone else, that when we are talking about democracy, there is a possibility that we kind of, we enter into the discussion with this idea that, I mean, India is a democracy, we come from India, or wherever we come from, for the most part, we have democratic regimes in the world. I mean, of course, to what extent are they democratic is something that can be discussed at length. But officially speaking, democracy happens to be, happens to be the political expression of the times we live in. So this idea that, we are talking about democracy and we live in India, or we live in Bangladesh, or we live wherever, and we've lived, as it were, in a democratic setup. So what is it that we can possibly, know further? Similarly, the idea of dialogue, we know, we have a certain idea that this is what dialogue is. So my position, my submission rather, is that I think once in a while, as students, as learners, as curious travelers, it is important for us to also keep this familiarity quotient in check. Familiarity needs to be checked in its tracks, so that we are open to this idea of being, shall I say, this idea of a sense of wonder, as it were. So this fundamental concern with familiarity is also something that I wanted to point out. Now let us now move on to what we are to discuss today: dialogue and democracy. Now let me start on an autobiographical note, and I suppose I suppose all of you would agree with me on this. So I'll start with dialogue and then move on to democracy. See, if I were to think about myself and my association with the word dialogue, when did it start? or if I were to recollect the earliest association or the earliest memory of the word dialogue, I would trace it back to films, right? So, for instance, dialogue. So, I mean, we would always talk about dialogue from the vantage point of cinema. So, of course, for a substantial period, it was Hindi cinema. So, for instance, dialogues of iconic films, Mughal Azam, Sholay, etc., etc. So we were understanding dialogue, particularly from the vantage point of a certain character and a performative utterance. And then, of course, as we became more mature and we had more access and we had more freedom, then of course it spilled over and we got into Hollywood and world cinema, etc. So dialogue in the beginning had to do with cinema. But of course, that is not really what we have here with us. Then, as we got into university education, one of the things that repeatedly was brought into consideration while discussing dialogue was education. So, for instance, particularly in liberal arts, and if you're doing a course on, say, sociology of education, or you're doing a course on critical pedagogy, or you're doing a course generally on reflexive sociology, etc., so then there is a repeated insistence on this idea of dialogue, that how dialogue is, or the centrality of dialogue, or the sheer indispensability of dialogue within the context of learning, education, pedagogy, etc. So we were again and again told. In fact, a great professor from JNU was quite hell-bent upon repeating himself every week, and he would say that every time the teacher is trying to teach, the teacher does not teach. Right. So the teacher, the more when the teacher is trying to teach, the teacher is not teaching. And only when the teacher stops this act of trying to teach, only then is the student initiated into what he called asking, right? So till the time I'm trying to teach, I am essentially not teaching. I'm not really performing the right pedagogical function. So we understood, we were told about dialogue in that context. And then, of course, along the same time, or maybe a little before, a little after, I don't exactly have the date frame in mind, but along the same time, we were also thinking about dialogue through newspapers, right? So in the context of conflicts, in the context of disagreements. So dialogue was considered, was referred to in relation to, disagreements within the region. So for instance, dialogue on Kashmir, India-Pakistan dialogue, some kind of disagreement that's been going on for a very long time. And the idea was that there is a certain way in which dialogue will do something about the disagreement that's been going on for a very long time. So there was an element of hope, there was an element of faith, as a result of which, or rather a hope or faith that was invested in this idea of dialogue. So this was the third understanding of dialogue, and this is all happening around college education. But then when you sort of when you acquire a more nuanced understanding of the ways in which society works and how human beings interact with each other, or what fundamentally constitutes human interaction, and where is the problem and where lies the promise, etc., that is when you begin to understand that dialogue actually is not necessarily just what I just talked about. It is not. I mean, of course, what we are to discuss has, to a certain extent, nothing to do with cinema uh, or drama world. It has, of course, something to do with the ways in which critical pedagogy, etc., are conceptualized. And to a certain extent, of course, policy dialogue or conflict-related dialogue. But there is more to dialogue, and this is something that we discerned as we read very unconventional, philosophers. So, for instance, one is you're reading official people who are associated with, say, peace studies, conflict studies, and when these people write on dialogue, they have a very distinct disciplinary bent, as a result of which they produce a certain kind of prose. But let's say you're reading a physicist like David Bohm, whose famous work on dialogue. There are two works that remain quite celebrated for social sciences humanities students on dialogue, and another work is on creativity. So American physicist who was majorly invested in this idea of dialogue. Or say, for instance, if you're reading someone like Krishnamurti, right, on dialogue, or you're reading someone like Krishna Kumar, an extraordinary educationist on the idea of dialogue, etc., etc. So rather than, of course, I'm not demeaning, and in fact, I'm not of that much consequence, actually. So I'm not dismissing or demeaning established scholars working in the realm of peace and conflict studies, right? What I'm essentially pointing out is that there are perhaps other ways in which one can engage with the idea of dialogue. And when we begin to look at it from that perspective, then what we immediately discern is that there's a world of difference between references that are otherwise taken as synonymous. So for instance, discussion, dialogue, conversation, etc. So you begin to then understand that dialogue is not necessarily just another conversation. Dialogue is, to a certain extent, or all conversations are not necessarily dialogues. So for instance, and dialogue is also not about a certain kind of a productive conversation, right? So these are things. So a conversation is, a conversation is essentially something that could be considered as an exchange, but the idea of a dialogue is essentially about is not necessarily restricted to an end, right? A dialogue could actually be something that takes place without an agenda, right? So although, as I must also put this on record, that there are scholars who've written on ideal conversation, and in that respect, they kind of treat conversation as a certain kind of dialogue. So I'm particularly reminded of the famous German philosopher, hermeneutician, Hans-Georg Gadamer, whose famous work, Truth and Method. In that particular work, Gadamer extensively reflects on the idea of conversation. And one of the things that he categorically insists on, he underlines, is that conversation is a process of two people understanding each other, wherein knowledge is not fixed. So two people understanding each other. Now we know that this is a very specific ideal reference of conversation. Conversations need not be geared towards understanding each other. And I'll come to the understanding bit related to conversation and dialogue in a bit. But as I said, that there are ways in which philosophers have also, drawn our attention to these references, say for instance, conversation, wherein we get this hint that, okay, this reference is also kind of suggesting that it is actually a dialogue. So what Gadamer is essentially hinting at by talking about conversation as an exchange that is geared towards earnest understanding is something that is very much also suggesting a certain kind of proximity to the idea of dialogue. And in that regard, he actually, I'm sure some of you are aware of this. He used the metaphor horizon, where horizon is essentially prejudice or set of prejudices. So he says that we invariably enter into exchanges with our own horizons. And a true conversation is one where fusion of horizons takes place, right? So I am able to go beyond my prejudices. I'm able to go beyond my assumption, because that is what understanding, or an earnest understanding, demands from me. Uh, but in the case of dialogue, what essentially, of course, there's more that is to be discussed a little later, but just to sort of passingly flag something, a conversation need not be between equals, need not be, right? A conversation can lead to a sense of parity, an earnest conversation, but a conversation need not be between equals. But if you go back to people like David Bohm and Krishnamurti, what they are insisting on is that a conversation is a dialogue is essentially a conversation between equals, right? So this is something, so a dialogue and a conversation. Similarly, we also think about discussion and dialogue. Not necessarily we, but in general, in society, there's a certain understanding that kind of pitches dialogue and discussion as synonymous. But we know that discussion has a more analytical bent. Discussion is about breaking down whatever is at our disposal. Discussion is about multiple opinions being pitched, tabled, and the idea is essentially discussion is geared towards a certain conclusion. Discussion is, in a way, is geared towards winning the game. So in discussion, we very forcefully, with a lot of conviction, with utmost faith, we pitch our ideas. So discussion has more analysis side to it, but dialogue might not be that geared towards analysis per se. Dialogue is more into a very open-ended, empathetic sort of engagement with other points of view that exist. So in discussion, usually it's about winning and losing, but in dialogue, uh, for the most part, I mean, if we are essentially looking at the ideal dialogic situation, in dialogue, everybody wins. So whether I get it or you get it or anyone else nails it, the point is everybody wins, because it is not necessarily an opposition. It is not necessarily an interaction the way we understand. It's a participation. So in that sense, a dialogue invariably leads to everybody winning, or for that matter, no one winning, right? If everybody wins, then no one wins. I mean, one could just extend that proposition as well. Uh, what is also important is that these days, of course, we have, I mean, there's just so much literature on dialogues, and there's so much consumption of this idea of dialogue. So, for instance, people have also pointed out, and in fact, people like Krishnamurti and others have also pointed out that a lot of what gets billed as dialogues are not necessarily dialogues. So, for instance, they point out this idea of policy dialogues, right? Cross-sector dialogue or stakeholder dialogues that we have. So usually what is important, what is to be discerned from these initiatives, these endeavors, is that there is a certain kind of there's a certain kind of occupation with effectiveness. So let's say if there is a dialogue initiative in an organization, or let's say stakeholders dialogue, what is it that is the objective? So the objective essentially has to do with some kind of efficiency, or some way in which the effectiveness of the organization could be, or the efficiency of the organization could be upscaled. Now, this is again, as people like Bohm and others would point out, that this is not necessarily the kind of dialogue that we want to talk about when we are discussing human society, or a more meaningful progress of human society. Dialogue as a means of that meaningful progress. So they point out that these trade-offs, or negotiations, or these policy dialogues are not necessarily, I mean, of course, they are called dialogues, and you cannot necessarily take the word dialogue off. You can't take the word dialogue away. But the fact of the matter is that dialogue perhaps it's a little more profound. It's something that draws our attention to something deeper, more meaningful. And in that regard, the first thing that we must begin with, perhaps, and I think it's a very important intervention, is that dialogue is not simply to be understood as a method or as a means of improving something. Because dialogue in its, I mean, it is something that has an independent value, right? This is something that I think Krishnamurti and others are trying to insist on. That let us think about dialogue as something that is not just a method to something, but dialogue as an activity in itself, which has an independent worth, which has an independent value. And in this regard, as I said, that I find the interventions made by David Bohm particularly insightful. So I'll just point out 2-3 important interventions made by David Bohm in his seminal lectures on dialogue in the 1970s, and this book got published later on in 1990s, I suppose. Bohm died in 1992, so yeah, sometime. I mean, it's a Routledge publication. I'm sure some of you are aware of that. So when we are discussing, so now that there is a certain kind of clarity, or let's say I have kind of made this clarification, that we are not at the moment interested in the ways in which organizations, multinational corporates understand dialogue. We are not interested in the ways in which dialogue essentially is something that is used for any kind of conversation that happens between two stakeholders or more stakeholders. Now it's time to sort of get into how do we understand the fundamentals of dialogue, and then from there, in what ways does that inform the practice and workings of democracy in our times? So for instance, dialogue in that sense is why do we need dialogue is a very, very important question. And this is not simply from the vantage point of management and administration. From the vantage point of human existence, the fundamental thing that some of these scholars, and in fact, many of these scholars who were writing at a time when there was this communication upsurge. So, for instance, 1960s, 70s, 80s, if you think about writings of people like Eric Fromm, people like Herbert Marcuse, people like David Bohm, of course, Krishnamurti, and in this, I mean, Zygmunt Bauman, etc. So what they are essentially telling us is that there is a new kind of world that is emerging where you have an extraordinary network of communication. You have all kinds of gadgets at your disposal. And of course, as we speak in 2020, things have only, I mean, the networks have only become more promising and denser. So what they're pointing out is that while on the one hand, this is something that is gradually happening and it's very much visible and apparent, but at the same time, communication has broken, right? So this is something that many media theorists have also written about. And this is something that some of these philosophers genuinely engaged with the workings of human reality are reflecting upon, particularly people like Eric Fromm and others, right? So how do we make sense of this, what they call the problem of communication? And in this regard, one thing that they pointed out was that how do we manage to live together in a world that is constantly changing? And this is a question that has actually occupied great minds across time. I mean, but of course, in the modern world, this question acquires more urgency because the rate of change is much higher, right? So, for instance, in the 19th century as well, people like Emil Durkheim and others, they were pointing out that how does society somehow remain together despite the fact that there are so many changes that are constantly happening? So similarly, people like David Bohm, people like Eric Fromm and others, the question that is Zygmunt Bauman, for instance, the question that is very fundamental is that how do people live together in an ever-changing world, in a world that just refuses to remain static for a moment, right? The world that is constantly changing. And also a world where a stranger is the most immediate reality, right? So for instance, earlier, before communication had its sway and before this incredible technological revolution, the stranger was a stranger. The stranger was not really in that sense seeable. But now what has happened is that the stranger actually is a part of your immediate frame of a frame of reference. So the question then that emerges is that how do we live together in this changing world, in this world that is characterized by extraordinary diversity and difference? Now, and this is also a world that is increasingly getting more and more interconnected and interdependent. Of course, the critique of globalization stands as credible, but for the lack of, I mean, I'm just giving a very passing reference that we live in a world, in an economic order where, things are actually, parts are more interconnected, more interdependent. And the problematic aspect of it is something that I'm fully aware of. But I just want to pitch this thing, that a world that is more and more interconnected and interdependent. Now, how do we sort of live together in this kind of a world? And what happens in this world is that what if individuals hold on to their own truths, right? So this is the question that disturbs many of these extraordinary minds. That if we hold on to our own opinions, if we hold on to our own positions, if we hold on to our own pasts, our own readings of truth, then in what ways would it be possible for us to live together? And this is a very, very, so then proponents of dialogue were essentially making a case for collective and coherent ways of thinking, right? Collective ways of thinking. So for instance, on the one hand, we have the individual, and the individual is essentially given the freedom to think, to write, to speak, etc. But at the same time, there is also a need to adhere to something coherent. I mean, David Bohm essentially calls it the tacit reality, right? The unspoken reality, something that is there, but it is not really spoken about, it's not really spoken of. So how do we sort of come together in that sense? In what ways could we initiate ourselves into or brush what some of these philosophers would call collective consciousness, right? In what ways can we actually initiate ourselves into coherent and collective ways of thinking? Now, the only possibility is when you have a flow of meaning, right? And dialogue is very, very important. In fact, dialogue is indispensable for that flow of meaning to take place, for that individual to sort of step up and become a part of that coherent way of thinking. And this is something that that people like David Bohm and Krishnamurti and others have categorically insisted on: coherent ways of thinking, right? Coherent ways of thinking, collective consciousness. I mean, collective consciousness not in the sense that Durkheim uses it, but collective consciousness in the sense that thinking together, a certain kind of a certain kind of triggering that brings us together, etc. Now, so if we were to think about flow of meaning and then begin to look at dialogue's role in that flow of meaning, one thing that immediately strikes us is that if dialogue is then to be understood from that vantage point, then what we realize is that it does not, very often people say dialogue offers a different path to truth. But I don't think that's how one can put it. While there could be a certain truth to that submission, but for us to sort of to make it perhaps more meaningful and more exciting a proposition, what we need to think about is that dialogue not only offers a different path to truth, but actually dialogue offers a different notion of truth. So different from different paths to truth to a different notion of truth. So from the individual to the collective, what happens is we are not just arriving at truth from a different vantage point, but we are essentially conceptualizing truth or the end result in a completely different way. So it's a new kind of mind as a result of dialogue. It's a new kind of mind that emerges, that comes into being, that acquires a life. It's a new mind. What dialogue also does, and this is something very important, I suppose, and particularly for us as learners, students, dialogue also questions intellectual fundamentalism. Very often, because we live in this world of ideas, and very often we kind of get carried away by the sheer charm and appeal of the world of ideas. I mean, we are able to talk about a lot of things, we reflect and we so forcefully, passionately argue. So once in a while, what happens is that there is a certain kind of intellectual determinism that also enters into our cognitive frames. And we might not be aware of it. We might not be reflecting on that. There's an extraordinary reference that is given by French philosopher, sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu actually called epistemic reflexivity, right? He says that, we need to, because epistemes, these frames of understanding things, they also condition our mind. So we need to go beyond that. So when we are discussing dialogue, we also need to understand the merit of dialogue in terms of how it, in a remarkably potent way, it kind of counters what we call intellectual fundamentalism. So, I mean, fundamentalism is, of course, of various sorts, but intellectual fundamentalism is the most, shall I say, it's the most dangerous of all, because we are the one who is a proponent of intellectual fundamentalism or an intellectual fundamentalist is essentially not aware of the sheer problems in terms of the way he or she is foregrounding his ideas, or his or her thesis and ideas. So this is something that that we can keep in mind. Another thing that is important about dialogue, and this is something that will be very important when we move on to democracy, is that dialogue is essentially geared towards the whole. So usually what happens is, and this is where the physicist comes in, David Bohm, what he points out is that the fundamental problem is with thought itself. And he says, and I think this is something that many scholars across millennia have talked about, that what the human thought does is it fragments, right? There's something, so thought fragments the reality, right? So it will always, cut it into symmetrical conveniences, right? So thought will always fragment the reality. And dialogue, an earnest, genuine dialogue, is always geared towards the whole. So it is a movement, it's a shift, it's a movement from the fragment to the whole, right? And which is why very often there is a certain kind of defense that enters into it from within. So there is a defense on our part. So because there are fears, There are anxieties, there are concerns that we have. So it's a risk that appears at the beginning. And so it is a movement from the fragment to the whole. In fact, there's a famous phrase that is used by this Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, I and thou. So, for instance, Buber essentially says that uh, an earnest human interaction is one where I am not treating you as a thing, right? So I should not treat you as it. I should treat you as thou, as a full-fledged whole individual. So wholeness is very important for any interaction to be earnest, for any interaction to be productive, or to be rather meaningful, not necessarily productive. Productive has other connotations as well. So we have to, so dialogue in that sense is geared towards the whole, and we have to understand the whole. And we can only understand the whole when we do away with unnecessary abstraction and analysis. The idea is that there has to be participation, and a genuine participation, and that participation will lead to what Bohm calls, or what people like Krishnamurti and others have also pointed out, participatory consciousness, right? Participatory consciousness, where each person, to borrow from them, to borrow from Bohm, each person is participating, is partaking of the whole meaning of the group, and also taking part in it, right? So it's both ways, right? So it's a contribution, it's also taking part. So it is not necessarily abstraction, it is not hardcore analysis and breaking down, it's just participation. And as we participate, we are gradually moving from the fragmented to whole, right? So the importance of whole in that sense. So what is it then that dialogue, or based on some of these things that I just shared with you, fundamentally speaking, something with which I started, dialogue is essentially an important tool, or through dialogue, we are we essentially get acquainted with, or familiarized with, or we get introduced to more viable ways of living together, right? It is only dialogue that helps us remarkably, in living together. So ultimately, the idea is to live with differences, like living together. And living together would also then imply, when you, I'm of course borrowing from a slightly different domain, but I think I can indulge a little. So for instance, let's say in a relationship, this is coming from a completely different context, but let's say in a relationship, let's say the couple, they want to live in, right? So they want to sort of take the relationship forward, as it were. So in various novels, in various serials, in various everyday real settings as well, there is a lot of conversation that goes on before they essentially take the plunge, right? So let's say they've been in a relationship for 5 years, 7 years, etc., but they want to live in. So it's like living together. So they are the same individuals. Nothing has changed. Yet it requires a lot of reflection and pondering. And very often in the media narratives, whenever there is no pondering, there is no reflection, eventually things don't necessarily fall in place. Of course, things might not fall in place even when there is a prolonged reflection. But what one is trying to point out is that living together is not necessarily a very sanitized business. Living together is a messed up, full of friction business. And the human mind, quite in a very subtle ways, tries to escape friction. So we always want to do away with, we always want to sort of avoid those moments that create friction. But proponents of dialogue, and dialogue from this vantage point, the likes, proponents such as Krishnamurti, David Bohm, Eric Fromm, and others, what they're pointing out is that we should not necessarily, have any kind of anxiety towards friction. Friction must emerge. Let it be a messed up situation. Let there be contradictions. Let there be differences. Let there be disagreements. But this is essentially part of the deal. So dialogue is not going to start between like-minded people. If we are all like-minded people, then what on earth are we doing by saying we are essentially investing in a dialogue? Dialogue is meant to be between other ends of this, ends of the spectrum, as it were. So there will be friction, but there has to be an openness towards friction. So living together is something that dialogue leads to. Living together is a messed up affair. Living together is not a sanitized, a clean, heavenly enterprise. It's one of the most chaotic, one of the most messed up frames of everyday existence. And one should not necessarily feel anxious about it. So in this emergent friction between contrasting values is, as they point out, at the heart of dialogue. Dialogue should not be deprived of this. Dialogue actually thrives as a result of this friction that exists. So what then we have before we move on to democracy is that it is a multifaceted process. It's a multifaceted process where it essentially tries to, it helps us understand what is thought as a process and not the content of thought. The content of thought is something that we think about, ponder over very often, right, quite regularly. But thought as a process is something that we only get to know through an earnest dialogue, right? So it's a multifaceted uh, process which essentially introduces us to unusually wide range of human experience. It informs us about not thought as a content, but the process, thought as a process, how it is sustained at the collective level. And this is how it is then. So dialogue in that sense is a certain kind of invitation. It's an invitation towards understanding what it means to be human, what fundamentally it implies. I mean, what does being human imply? This is something that dialogue make invites us to. And the creative potential dialogue is in that sense simply to reveal. Dialogue essentially reveals the deeper structures of our consciousness, right? So dialogue is not just about me and you talking. Dialogue is about essentially in due course getting to know what is it that constitutes the deeper structures of my consciousness, right? So it is essentially a very, very informed, a very, very meaningful exercise, a non-judgmental curiosity, as it were. Now let's say this is what we have at the moment. Now let us move on to, I mean, very, very quickly, because I already have spent about 35 odd minutes. Let us move on to the idea of democracy, and then try and see where we can see connections and in what ways dialogue can sort of inform democracy. Again, democracy is a word that needs no introduction. We grew up writing, the almost irritating definition of democracy: by the people, for the people, etc. I mean, all of us, I mean, at least I wrote on several occasions, and I also secured marks for that. So we know that democracy is something that kind of that for wherein it's a system where people are at the center, right? You just can't wish the people away. I don't want to get into, again, a very conventional introduction. Demo means that, crazy means this. I mean, we are all aware of that. In fact, some of you might know much more than I do on democracy. But I just want to draw our attention to some of the crucial dimensions that might help us, see the connections between democracy and dialogue. Uh, People are at its core. People are the ones who elect those who rule. The final decision making rests with those who are elected by the people. You have free and fair elections. You have elections wherein those who are in power have a fair chance to lose. Otherwise, elections are of no use. I mean, for instance, the current dispensation, not necessarily a while ago, but a couple of months ago, one of the esteemed ministers said that we are going to rule for the next 50 years. Now, of course, that doesn't really gel with a very fundamental democratic sentiment. So every election must be of the kind where there is a genuine fair chance of, or there's a genuine shot at defeating those who are in power. So that's, regular, free, fair elections. Then there is a rule of law, as it were. So rules are within the limits of the constitution or the laws that are there in the constitution, and there are citizens' rights, etc. So there's a transaction, etc. So we know this. And we also know, we are also told that democratic government is better than other forms of government because you have more accountability, you have transparency, you have a certain kind of representation in the overall landscape, and you have a more deliberative decision making, etc. So we are kind of aware of this whole package called democracy. But what is important to remember is, and this is where I want to push this discussion further, is that there are multiple ways in which democracy as an idea is understood. So, for instance, one is democracy as a principle or a doctrine of government, something that we just discussed. Then democracy as an institutional arrangement, right? Or institutional arrangements, or setup of constitutional devices. And then democracy as a type of behavior, right? So these three might go together and might not always go together, right? And all we need to do is just look around, think about it, and we will realize that yes, actually, all of them don't necessarily go together. Democracy as a type of behavior, democracy as an institutional arrangement, and democracy as a doctrine or as a principle of government. So very often when we discuss democracy, we consider democracy as the most heavenly of all the things that we have around. In fact, it is considered as the most fantastic, the most extraordinary achievement of the human race as far as the political expression of humanity is concerned. And I think one could argue that. I mean, arguably, of course, one can, one can sort of live with that. One can also side with that proposition. But what is also important is that there are democratic ways in which democracies also get mutilated, or democratic behavior gets suppressed. So for instance, this idea, and this is something that has been pointed out by several scholars, this idea that we are a democracy can itself lead to all kinds of non-democratic behavior, right? This conviction and constantly telling ourselves, right? This very, very deep-rooted conviction that we are a democracy, they are not a democracy, we elect our representatives, this is what the rule of the, this is what people's mandate is, etc., etc. When we are positioning ourselves in that landscape of various propositions, then there is a likelihood that we also as a society indulge in various kinds of non-democratic behavior. So democracy as a behavior is something that is hardly found in most of the polities that are officially considered as democratic polities. Now, in what possible ways can then we think about dialogue and democracy? So I started with this idea that, democracy, I mean, when we talk about democracy, the first thing that comes to our mind is people. But then as students, as students of society and life, we know very well that people is not necessarily a homogeneous category. So for instance, within the people, you have a variety of identities. So how do we then engage with this diversity? And it is in this regard that when we are talking about democracy and dialogue, we need to sort of, as it were, do something slightly unconventional. Because usually when people are talking about dialogue in the context of democracy, they're talking about how the rulers, the representatives should have dialogue with other stakeholders. So people are essentially talking about various organs, people are talking about media, people are talking about civil society, etc., intellectuals, etc., etc. But here, what I'm essentially pointing out is that this is something that's been discussed for a very long time, right? So, I mean, this idea that, those who are at the helm of affairs need to invest more in dialogue, right? So the politicians, the leaders, the representatives, the executive, they must invest more and more in dialogue. They should be open to understanding the diversity. I mean, I'm particularly taking the case of India, the diversity of India, the cultural differences, the extraordinarily alarming diversity, as it were, that we have. So we keep pitching this idea that, you know, people who are taking care of things, people who are in the office must become more dialogic, must invest more in dialogue. But actually, I'm not here for the sake of making it a little more provocative. I'm essentially not following that line of argument. That is the line of argument that is very much there. And I don't think that can be contested. That's a very, very important line of argument. But what I am position, but my position is that let us think about people per se, right? Are we, when we are discussing democracy, are we also interested in talking about a democratized people, right? Or people with democratic aspirations, right? Or people who endorse or who subscribe to what is quintessentially a democratic behavior. And I want to particularly point out two, three things here. I mean, someone like, and so the reason why I want to insist on this is because when we are talking about people from within the spectrum called people, we'll have to then shift our attention to the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, because only then we can actually bring in this connection between dialogue and democracy in a slightly different, unconventional way. So let us think about the most deprived of the people. So let's say in the context of India, let's say we are talking about Dalits, we're talking about any of the marginalized communities, we're talking about the minorities, we're talking about the tribals, we're talking about tribal women, further marginalized, Dalit women, etc. Now, these people will always have a certain expectation, right, from what we call people's rule or rule by the people, of the people, etc. So how do we take care of this section of the people, right? And in what possible ways can dialogue be brought in? I'm reminded of a fantastic expression made by the most legendary modern Indian, B.R. Ambedkar. Ambedkar, in one of his speeches, in fact, I think it was the speech that he delivered in the Constituent Assembly, Ambedkar says that democracy actually is not to be understood as a political form of living, and democracy is not to be restricted to a political expression. He says democracy is to be understood as an associated mode of living, right? In fact, he says, in fact, in the same speech, he says that there are three things that we need to do in order to make sure that we are able to save our democracy from save our democracy from tyrants and dictators and populist, as it were, leaders. And he said that we need to follow constitutional methods. And he also says that we must not lay our liberties at the feet of a great man. He was, of course, he had lifelong issues with Gandhi. So he was very clear about that people should not just go blindly into this kind of allegiance. And lastly, he says, making our political democracy or turning our political democracy into a social democracy, which is to say, so what is this shift about from political democracy to social democracy? So political democracy is one, but technically speaking, things are in place, right? Technically, everything is in place. What is the technicality of it? Voting will take place, elections will happen, people will cast their votes, there will be a certain turnout, and you will have representatives, you will have people in the parliament, you will have debates, you will have sessions, you will have bills tabled, you will have laws made, etc., etc. But a social democracy is one where a certain kind of equal political recognition is realized by various sections, not given, realized by various sections of the polity. So for instance, again, in fact, yes, in Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar, very in an extraordinarily profound way, he says why social reform is required for political reform. So without social reform, you cannot have political reform. He also points out why social reform is necessary for economic reform. So the point is that the people, you need to work at the level of people. So this people, we cannot just have a for granted understanding of this idea called the people. I'm also reminded of a famous essay by Tagore, Nationalism in India, which was published in 1917, at the peak of the First World War, wherein Tagore, at the opening, I think the opening line, if I remember correctly, says, rights are fundamental problem is social and not political. Right? So political problem is not fundamental. Fundamentally, the problem is social. What does that mean? That we need not be obsessed with, and of course he's writing at the time of First World War, when nationalism has acquired the status of, god of the modern world, or let's say religion of the modern world. So he is writing in that context. But to come back to what we're discussing right now, people. So the social is fundamentally the problem. So the idea is that how do we, if we then borrow dialogue, the idea of dialogue and democracy, what is it that I'm trying to pitch? What I'm trying to pitch is that democracy then is not just to be looked at as a form of government. That is a technicality that we can definitely leave for the moment. That is not something that I'm here to contest. But democracy as a certain kind of aspiration, democracy as a certain kind of behavior. So for instance, one of the things that democracy must do, and unfortunately has not done in pretty much all the polities of the world that claim to be democratic, is democratizing the masses, right? Inculcating this democratic spirit in them. So for instance, let me give you an example. So example goes like this. So for instance, we talk about consultation. We say that in democracy, there is transparency, there is consultation, there is discussion. So let us think about any bill that is tabled in the parliament. So let's say you have, I'm just going by a very tentative, convenient number. Let's say you have 100 members and the bill is to be tabled. Now I happen to be one of the members, right? So when I leave my house in the morning, and today in the session, the bill is to be tabled, there has to be a debate, there has to be discussion, etc., etc. Now, when I leave in the morning, I know that I have to side with those who are for the bill, right? So this is 9 o'clock in the morning. I am leaving my mansion and I am heading to the parliament or the state assembly house, wherever. I reach there. For several hours, there is debate. And very often, a lot of people point out some things that are remarkably sensible, right? So let's say, if we were to just pitch a case, let's say we are discussing something in relation to citizenship, for instance, right? So there is a way so there are a lot of people who are trying to, pitch very sensible remarks. No one can disagree, but the fact remains that these are in the light of the trajectory of Indian politics and the trajectory of citizenship in India. These are incredibly sensible, intellectually sound propositions. But I left my house this morning knowing and, with this conviction that I have to side with the bill. So I'm for the bill. So 8 hours of discussion, 4 hours of discussion, 2 hours of discussion does not really matter. Whenever the voting will happen, 76 people will vote for the bill and 24 people will vote against the bill, right? So what I'm essentially trying to point out is that where the hell is this idea of dialogue and discussion, right? So if I'm leaving my house in the morning with this idea that I have to cast my vote in favor of the bill, and some of the most extraordinary, speakers of parliament have spoken, and they have spoken sense. They are not just eloquent people. I'm not essentially falling for the eloquence of the likes of Shashi Tharoor. What I'm essentially pointing out is that something sensible is being pointed out, right? That if you are genuinely listening, if you are earnestly geared towards understanding, then what will happen is that you will, in a sense, shift your loyalty. You'll say, fair enough, this is not going to work. I must oppose the bill. That doesn't happen. It has hardly happened in the history of democracy. So usually people enter with, as it were, their horizons, if we go back to Gadamer, and fusion of horizons does not take place. So what I am essentially pointing out, number one, is that democracy, when we're saying dialogue and democracy, I am more interested in talking about how at the level of people, at the level of, in this case, representatives, how at the level of people we can bring in a more dialogic spirit. Let me give you another example. We talked about understanding a while ago. Now, very often people use this phrase. We say, so I might say you don't understand, or very often very close friends might have this grievance that you did not understand me, he didn't understand, she didn't understand. What exactly does understanding entail? What does it mean to understand something? And and I'm just borrowing a theological reference at the moment. So for instance, very often prophets would say, so they would, in their conversation, or let's say in their communication to God, they would say, forgive them for they do not understand. Jesus is essentially quoted as quoted saying this in the Bible. Forgive them for they do not understand. What does it mean, they do not understand? What it essentially means is that the moment you understand something, your life is going to change, right? There is a cost to understanding. After understanding, you don't remain the same person. So for instance, if you have understood exploitation, if you have understood inhuman treatment, if you have understood poverty, if you have understood backwardness, if you have understood marginalization and violence, then your life has to change. Your everyday life must change. If it hasn't changed, then you haven't understood. So if we have understood global warming, then it has to have a certain bearing on the ways in which we live in our everyday lives. So for instance, to come back to this dialogue and democracy thing, let's say people, what does it mean to understand marginalization, right? So let's say that we are talking about a constituency where, and I'm giving an example, and I'm taking my chances here, but I'm willing to take the risk. So there is a constituency where you have four communities, A, B, C, D. I'm not naming the communities. Let's say that one of the communities is essentially of lower caste people, right? And it is, in terms of numbers, it's very few. So let's say 5% of the overall constituency is from this particular community. And for the remaining 70% of one community, 20% of another, and you can do the maths, right? The remaining bit. All I'm saying is that there is one community that's hardly there. It's just there. Now, if people are democratic, if they are initiated into democracy as a behavior, then the idea is, then what the practice would be, that a person from this particular community would contest, and more importantly, would win. But that would never happen. Why it would not happen? Because democracy, unfortunately, has been reduced to borrow from Marx, icy waters of calculation, right? Marx famously wrote this in the Communist Manifesto. All that is, what is it called? Celestine prophecies, the most sentimental ecstasy, all heavenly ecstasies are drowned into the icy waters of calculation. So democracy has also been reduced. So we are not, to go back to this idea of understanding, we are not willing to understand what it means to be a marginalized, a tribal, a Dalit, a minority, a woman, a disabled, a person from a conflict zone, etc., etc., right? Because we might as well talk about it, but the day we understand what it means to be someone from a zone that is torn apart by conflict, by violence, what it means to be someone who has been perpetually subjected to harassment, who's been perpetually subjected to atrocity, violence, etc. The day we understand, that is the day when we cease to be the individual that we've been over the years. That is the day when a new individual emerges. To go back to what David Bohm was pointing out, a new mind emerges. Because this is when you essentially acquire a certain collectivity. You begin to associate yourself with the marginalized. As Ambedkar would point out, associated mode of living. And you don't associate yourself with the capitalists. Ambedkar did not mean that you associate yourself with the privileged, you associate yourself with the powerful. No, with the elites. Ambedkar is essentially pointing out that association in a democratic sense has to be with the marginalized. Because otherwise it's not, The other kind of association is very much there, right? The upper caste, the elite, and the industrialists. There is an unholy alliance, and the association knows no limits, right? But what Ambedkar was essentially pointing out was that there is a way in which, and this is how dialogue will work. The dialogue, not in terms of various stakeholders. This is something that we've talked about repeatedly, but dialogue in terms of understanding, in terms of going beyond our horizons. So I should be able to go beyond my identity as a privileged individual, not as a marginalized individual. So in that sense, a moment of dialogue, and I'll end with this, a moment of dialogue is essentially a moment when we are able to raise ourselves above our identity. And I'm talking about the majority privileged identity. I'm not talking about tribals, I'm not talking about Dalits, I'm not talking about women. I mean, in general, I'm not talking about minorities. When we are able to, and democracy fundamentally wants us to go beyond our identities. Because if we do not go beyond our identities, majority identity, if we do not go beyond our identities, then democracy is simply a sham. It's a technicality. It is not ethically the practice that we want it to be. It is technically what it is, but it will not be. So, for instance, the example that I gave, if people only vote on the basis of their majority identity, then of course it's hopeless. Every election, one after another, those who are 5%, those who are 2%, those who are 3%, they have no shot at representation whatsoever. So this is, and why? Because the understanding has not happened. Those who belong to 70% refused, or rather failed to understand that the moment there is a representative from the 5%, he or she will be a representative of everyone. This is something that democracy has failed to educate us about. Now, just to end, now, I mean, we talked about all this, very exciting ideas, dialogue, the practice of democracy, the idea of the marginalized, how, it could be more dialogic, how we could raise ourselves above our identity, etc. But the question that I think is important for all of us is that any positioning of these things has to be contextualized as well. So, for instance, if I have to pitch the idea of dialogue, and I have to pitch the idea of democracy in the larger context within which we live, it's a fairly unfortunate, as it were, canvas that we are a part of. So, for instance, we are living in times, and I think it is important to remember this. We are living in times that that breed a culture of superficiality. I'm reminded of a fascinating lecture. In fact, you might want to read this lecture at some point. It's the commencement address at Harvard in 1978 by this famous Russian novelist, writer, poet, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So Solzhenitsyn delivered this 1978 lecture. It was titled A World Split Apart. And this is, of course, to do with the Cold War politics. And the starting point of this essay, the lecture, the address, is that and remember, this is 1978, right? Approximately, 40 years, more than 4 decades ago. He says that two of the core problems that plague the world right now, 1978, are the problem of superficiality and the problem of hastiness. These are the two things that he said. Now, he said this in 1978. Enter 2020, and we know that Solzhenitsyn spoke as a prophet. It was absolutely prophetic on his part. Superficiality and hastiness. There is so much hastiness on our part. Now, if there is so much hastiness where everything needs to be done instantaneously, right? So whether it's the culture of instant messaging, I mean, if I'm WhatsApping, I also get to know that you're typing, right? The makers of WhatsApp thought that it would help in getting more and more people onto the platform if we could simply, hint that, all right, the other person is typing, the other person has seen your message, etc., etc. There are apps, and what should I say? It was beyond words, a feeling. The other day, I saw an ad where it was talking about an app, and it was a fairly racist ad, a black man talking to a white friend, a woman friend of his, and he says, that I don't think I'll ever be able to, get this girl as my girlfriend. And this white girl then says, why, what's wrong? And he says that she reads classics, she reads literature, and I haven't read some of these books that she has read. So then this girl says, oh, don't worry, there is an app. And on that app, all you need to do is just type the name of the book. So for instance, Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, an extraordinary work, voluminous. All you need to do is just type War and Peace. There will be 3 paragraphs. You read those 3 paragraphs, and now you can speak on War and Peace, right? You can read 3 paragraphs, a summary of Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, or Man Without Qualities by Eric Rommel. I mean, you can do, Emily, you can read summaries, and you can suddenly become this person who has read the book. Now, what kind of a culture is this? Where within 2 minutes we want to be an expert on War and Peace, Anna Karenina. Within 2 minutes we want to be an expert on, say, the crisis in the Middle East, etc., etc. Now, this is something that is very, very important to keep in mind when we are discussing the fate of democracy, the practice of democracy, because democracy is also going to operate within us. I mean, it is not something that is operating outside us, lesser mortals. It is very much a part and parcel of a part of the texture of our everyday political expressions. So if there is so much tentativeness, if there is so much superficiality, if everything is a transaction, if everything is to be understood in terms of profit and loss, loss and gain, if everything is, again, to go back to Marx, to be drowned in waters of calculation, then of course, we will have a crisis as far as, democracy is concerned, and we will definitely have crisis. Let's say we will have no audience whatsoever for the idea of dialogue. I mean, who on earth would want to invest in dialogue? How many of us have got the time to then, patiently invest in it, wait, trust, with hope and faith? So, I mean, I think when we are discussing, I mean, of course, there are other things as well that could have been talked about, but I just wanted to, I mean, I just want to end with this, that when we are discussing some of these very, very crucial ideas like dialogue, democracy, and the connections, etc., then what we also need to be mindful of is that we are operating in a larger socio-political cultural matrix, and within that matrix there's a way in which everyday transactions are determined. So unless the larger, in that sense, workings of culture and politics and economy are worked out, and there is, thorough meditative reflection on these dynamics, we might not be able to do much in the realm of these, in the realm of dialogue and democracy. Thank you very much for your patient listening. That will be all from my end.
Thank you, Dr. Farooqi, for this very thought-provoking talk. Uh, Now moving on to our discussion and questions and answers. I think Muhammad Balir wants to go first. Balir, please introduce yourself very quickly and then ask your question.
So thank you, Dr. Farooqi, for your enlightening lecture on dialogue and democracy. So I'll just introduce myself as a student of international relations from Manipal University. I've done a master's in geopolitics and international relations. Now I'm preparing for my PhD in the same subject. So my question is based on the same thing with the Indian context, sir. When we talk about dialogue and democracy, and we look at the situation in the parliament right now, going back to what happened like 2 days ago, they said they switched off the mics of the opposition and passed 15 bills in one day. So how do you look at the future of dialogue and democracy in the Indian context, given the example?
Okay. Beza, do I attend to questions one by one, or do you think we'll have 3 questions at once?
However you wish. If you
Okay, so
want
I'll
to
just
take
straight away, I guess I'll straight away attend to this, try to, and then we can move on to the next question. Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's a very, I mean, you see, these are concerns that, you see, I'll just start on a slightly pessimistic note, I should say. You see, the unfortunate bit is, the tragic bit is that not many are essentially considering this situation in Parliament as a tragic situation. This is where my concern is as a student of, the everyday, the political everyday. So for instance, simply put, I mean, I don't think it requires brains, as it were, or it requires a hardcore training in political science, or a clear-cut understanding of how democracies work, to be able to understand that this is absolutely unacceptable, or this is atrociously, this is atrocious, to say the least. But the fact, and the question that I have, and this is a question that I want to pose before you as well, or everyone else, that why do they do this, right? What is it that informs their agency, right? As they put, people on the other side, I mean, their mic on mute, right? As they mute, as it were, the other side. I mean, there's hardly, as we speak, there's hardly another side. There are just very few left, and that's also sort of shrinking. That space is also shrinking. But my question is, and I think this is where the answer lies, because they are of the view that this is precisely how the people of this country, at least a section of this country, they want it. So for instance, if a majority, if a substantial chunk of the Indian population were to openly critique this, were to openly condemn this absolutely unacceptable behavior in the middle of the parliament, right? A building sacrosanct for various other reasons, of course, then of course, this behavior is not to be repeated. But which is why I said that I am not, I think gone are the days. I don't, I mean, call me whatever, but I don't expect much from the representatives at the moment. I am more inclined towards the people. I am more inclined towards the core, the bedrock of democracy. So my submission is that there is a way in which there's a way in which they bring forth a certain conviction. There is a force with which they do this. They know it for a fact that this is not going to create any issue. And who are the people who will speak about it? Who are the people who will criticize it? I mean, these are the people who criticize things in any case, right? They are always criticizing. So for instance, you might have also heard a lot of times, a lot of people from the regime, they keep saying that we need to be positive, that we need to have positivity. And a very strange connection between democracy and positivity. I mean, who on earth can actually, in a certain sense, help us understand this connection? So again and again, we are told that there is just too much negativity. We should not be negative. And what does negativity imply? That we should not criticize. We should not be dissenting. We should not be protesting. There should not be any demonstration. There shouldn't be rallies, etc., etc. Now, I'm not saying that rallies are all the time meaningful. I mean, once in a while, rallies could be, strategic acts as well. And they could also be, what should I say, demonstrative acts of numbers. But generally speaking, this is a very problematic framing, this idea of negativity and positivity. So for instance, those who are questioning the regime, or those who are questioning those in power, are immediately considered as those who are always negative in terms of their attitude. They can't see the positivity. India is essentially, it's a glorious civilization that is on to acquiring more glory in weeks to come, etc., etc. I'm reminded of another example, and I'll end with this. Very often we talk about news anchors who are shouting, right? We talk about it, and we also, I mean, there are jokes, there are memes, and we take pride in circulating these memes, and we think that we've done our bit in terms of social engineering and political sensitization. But think about it for a moment. I mean, a moment of pause and reflection. See, so for instance, let's say there's a news anchor who is, in the name of debate and discussion, who's just shouting, and so are other panelists. Everyone is shouting. You have no idea what the hell is being discussed. No clue what is it that the contention is about, etc., etc. They're just shouting at each other. At times, elementary stuff of cordiality is entertained, but for the most part, not cordial at all. Now we think that this is just a program that's for an hour and it's over. No, it has a larger functionality to it. I would say that there is, to borrow from sociology, there's a latent function that's there. What's the latent function? The latent function is that many people across the country begin to say that debates and discussions are meaningless, right? They begin to understand that this is exactly what happens when you call for debates and discussions. And that's tragic. I mean, that's in fact uncommonly tragic. If a lot of us begin to say that there is no point contemplating, there is no point indulging in exchange of ideas, then where do we go as a polity? Where do we go as a society? Where do we go as a nation or as a community? And this is precisely what some of these TV debates have done. That for the most part, people laugh at it, but there is a consensus that's there across the nation that tells us, and you can conduct an SMS poll, although it's the most shady thing to be done. But usually, I mean, if you were to do it, in no time you will have a majority suggesting that discussions are pointless, that discussions are all about noise, that discussions are all about people fighting each other, and just there's no patience, there is no empathy, there is no element of understanding. So to go back to the parliament thing, I think that this is something that should not really surprise us. To me, what is surprising is that there is no people's response, because a democracy, end of the day, is all about people. If something happens, people should respond. I mean, my representative should not respond. If my representative responds, that's just a number in the parliament. But imagine if a substantial population, if a major chunk of the population is on the road, or is at least getting its grievance registered on social media or through other platforms, then I think hopefully in future people will be a little more mindful that they cannot really put because I mean, and why do you want to put them on mute? Because they don't have numbers. So had it been a head to head, had it been a neck to neck stuff, then I think they would have refrained from doing that, right? There would have been some element of restraint. But if it's just about, 200 on the one side and 35 on the other, to hell with what they want to say. I mean, just put them on mute. Why unnecessarily waste time? No matter how long they speak, numbers won't change. So why bother, right? Why bother? Why give them time? Just get done with it. So put them on mute, pass as many bills as you can. So my position is, I don't know whether you agree with me or not, but I'm just making this submission that it is essentially the arrogance of numbers and nothing else. Whoever has done this, or whoever are the people who do this, it is simply informed by a very misplaced arrogance of numbers. So when democracy is reduced to a very crass mathematics, these are the theatrics that you are bound to witness in parliament. This will happen not just here, this will happen across the world, when you will have democracy being reduced to a very crass, shallow engagement with numbers. So when people are turned into numbers, I'm reminded of Rohit Vemula's letter, wherein he writes his suicide. I mean, of course, it was an institutionalized murder, but his suicide note says that I have been reduced to a number, right? This is precisely what he was pointing out. So every other crisis within the realm of democracy could be traced back to what Rohit so profoundly argued in his last exchange, in his last communication. That will be all.
Sabiha More.
Yeah.
Ma'am, you should unmute yourself.
Hello, Dr. Irfanullah. The moment I saw your designation as a professor of sociology, the brotherhood created, because I've been teaching sociology for last 30 years in a college in Mumbai. Of course, I'm teaching sociology of education and education of sociology because I'm in a B.Ed college. Okay. But it was very nice to know that there is a sociology of literature also, yes, which you did your PhD on. And half my question was already been asked by somebody I'd written though. that, yeah, the theatrics that happen in the parliament every day, the clowns and the circus that takes place every day is not a dialogue at all. It is not a dialogue. It is a monologue, basically, where people come and think. So my first question is that, is it the end of dialogue or in democracy? Is it going to be like this for n number of years, or like in the Middle East, the Jasmine Revolution or the Arab Spring that we saw? We'll have to wait for somebody to come as a dictator or a authoritarian or a totalitarian, and then people will get up from the somber and come together and demonstrate on the streets, and then probably we are going to understand. Or for example, what is happening in Belarus with Alexander Lukashenko and the people who are almost on the street for a month protesting that they don't want Alexander Lukashenko to become the next president. My first question is this, and second is that uh, once upon a time, if you look at the history of literature between 1910 to 1947, all literatures, whether it was Hindi, Urdu, for that matter, Marathi, they all had instilled in the people a sense of freedom. There was a freedom literature that goes from 1920, right from Premchand to,
Yep.
I think, up to Jaishankar Prasad, and from Marathi, Tilak to Kusmagraj. Everybody has written about this. Why do we fail to see people writing that kind of literature, which was so prolific? It was so full of people to understand that nay, we have to have some dialogue. You cannot just go the way you want to do. And you have done PhD on Faiz Ahmad Faiz, and Hum Dekhenge is about going against General Ziaul Haq, a woman wearing a black sari, and she's coming on a stadium when he had said that nobody will wear black. She dared to wear a black sari, and
Sleeveless, sorry.
she read this thing, and the whole stadium, 50,000 were, like this thing. And again, I'll quote Faiz. He says that, दिल ना उम्मीद ही तो है, नाकाम तो नहीं, लंबी है गम की शाम मगर शाम ही तो है.
दिल
हाँ,
ना
दिल
उम्मीद
ना
तो
उम्मीद ही
नहीं.
तो है, नाकाम तो नहीं,
नहीं
लंबी है
दिल
गम
ना
की
उम्मीद
शाम
तो
मगर
नहीं,
तो
नाकाम.
नहीं, राइट. लंबी है गम की शाम मगर शाम. तो शाम ही है कि अंधेरा हो गया. मेरे कहने का ये मतलब है कि खत्म, अब कुछ नहीं हो सकता है. That is what I want to ask. Thank you.
Well, thank you, ma'am. I think I don't think I'm in a position to answer. I think these are very earnest inquiries, and they require longer deliberations. And I think as teachers, we cannot really afford to be pessimistic. I mean, if we become pessimistic, then we are done as a community. But I also want to point out. I mean, I don't think it's the end of dialogue. I don't think anyone has talked about it. Although people have written about how democracies have failed, how democracies have been mutilated. Already, various political philosophers, writers have written on this extensively. That now we are seeing almost a wave, of populist authoritarian regimes across the world, and very conveniently, in a very subtle way, democracies are kind of leaving behind other kinds of structures. But to answer your question, I would nonetheless point out that the situation is quite grim. It's grim in the sense that institutions, of course, we've lost the institutions, and we've also lost out on this confidence, or let's say this trust in people, because I mean, eventually it is, as I was saying earlier as well, that eventually our hopes fall on the people, right? So we don't. I mean, for instance, one example that I have in mind is of Gandhi. Of course, Gandhi remains one of the most controversial figures as far as the history of the national struggle is concerned, or the 20th century political history of India is concerned. But one thing that Gandhi did was he informed people of their agency. And as Gandhi famously told Irwin, that one thing that you must understand is that several thousand British cannot control millions of Indians if they do not want to be controlled. right? So for instance, I mean, I think that is a very different, very nuanced position of democracy, making people aware of their agency. I'm also reminded of a very, an extraordinary exchange in Satyajit Ray's Pratidwandi, where the protagonist has gone for the interview, and the board asks him this question, that what do you think is the most extraordinary moment of this century? And he says Vietnam War. And then they're suddenly quite surprised because they didn't expect this. And they say, why do you say this? And one thing that this person says, of course, this is Ray's genius. He says that the peasants never thought they had it in them, right? That they could check the most blatant imperial onslaught, right? So they never thought they had it in them. So democracy, as I was saying in the course of my presentation as well, the democracy also, I think one of the things that democracy must do is that it should inform people of their agency, that they can do wonders, that they can bring about magical transformations. This is something that has unfortunately ceased to happen. Now, where exactly, I mean, as an academic, as a teacher, student, one thing that I realize, and I think this is where we will have to blame ourselves, and I'm willing to, bear the burden of the guilt here, is that I think somewhere teachers have also kind of lost out on, for the most part. I mean, teachers could have, in a sense, informed this strengthening of democracy, particularly, say, regional universities. Look at the kind of masses we have in regional colleges, universities. If we were to genuinely invest in the vocation of teaching, and I have seen remarkable things happening inside the classroom. I mean, I was trained in JNU. So one of the things that the university did was, God knows when, but it just happened one fine day. Again, I don't have the calendar reference, but it informed us that these are the things that are inappropriate and these are the things that are appropriate. This is right, this is not right. And it has, now there is no going back, right? No matter what happens in this life, that understanding is so hard. Its foundations are so deep, and this happened inside the classroom someday, due to some lecture at some point in the university. So what I'm pointing out is that universities had a very deep connection with democracy. Universities had a very important role to play in, strengthening democracy, in helping us engage with cultural differences. For instance, idea that people should come from various corners of the country, so that in a classroom I get to, in JNU for instance, I got to know about the Northeast, about Odisha, about Rajasthan, tribals from various states of India, etc. So university teachers, I suppose, have they will have to, we will have to hold ourselves accountable, because I think there's been a certain kind of laxity on our part. Because in our classrooms, if we were just doing what a truly speaking a pedagogue is supposed to do, a remarkable engagement with ideas, I think then perhaps some hope, I think still there is a possibility of some hope emerging from the classrooms. That is one. The other thing is, in general as well, those who are aware of the problems are usually, and I think this is a typical middle class problem. I think usually we have this very strange, peculiar contentment vis-a-vis discussions within like-minded circles, right? So, for instance, over the weekend, people would just catch up. There are these WhatsApp groups, and of course on Facebook walls as well. I'm constantly, so on my Facebook wall, it's the most life-affirming wall that you can be an audience to. Everything is against atrocity, against marginalization, against the high-handedness of the regime, and you realize that, good Lord, the society is very much in with us, hand in gloves. But that might not be the case. So this like-mindedness, the convenience with which these conversations happen. So this what should I say? This crossing of the caste, as it were, that is something that can perhaps take us a little forward. So I don't think it's really the end, But if we genuinely, if we carefully look at what all has happened in the past few years, something that the gentleman was pointing out a while ago, the most, the most ridiculous, the most inconceivable things would happen, and there is just no response. There is just no response from the public. I'm not saying, I mean, civil society is meant to do that. I mean, Yogendra Yadav will speak against it. Apurvanand will write against it. Harsh Mandar will, of course, do what he's been doing for decades now. But this is routinization of dissent in a certain way, as Ralph Dahrendorf pointed out in Class and Class Conflict. Very routinized dissent, very, very routinized. So there's nothing extraordinary about it. There are few people who will always write about it. There are few people who always speak against it, but that's just that. But as far as making a dent is concerned, that is something that is unfortunately not happening. And if it goes on, if this trend goes on for another few years, then I'm assuming things might become a little more tragic. The situation might become grimmer. And if I were to respond to the question, then unfortunately, I might as well say that it seems that there is an end. But as far as, I mean, as long as we are able to keep this is a very modest intervention that I think, but as long as we are able to keep our classrooms lively, I think we will do our bit in saving democracy to the extent we can. I mean, whether it's just 2, 3 individuals, 5 individuals from one batch, that in itself is a contribution of sorts. But of course, the conversations need to go beyond like-minded circles. The dialogue must sort of, in that sense, gear towards fusion of horizons. This is something that I would say in relation to the first query that you had. Of course, a very tentative answer. I was also thinking while responding. The second thing in relation to the freedom literature, I mean, one of the things that we discuss when we do sociology of literature or sociology of knowledge is that ideas or thought is always in a deep relationship with being, right? I mean, of course, Marx famously talked about it in German ideology, but people like Karl Mannheim and others in the early 20th century, particularly Ideology and Utopia, the famous work that becomes the foundational text for sociology of knowledge. So ideas and the social context have a certain relationship. So there's a certain mood as a result of which freedom literature, because the decolonization struggle, because Gandhi's extraordinarily charismatic appeal, a certain kind of tempo, as it were. And also, I mean, these are also writers who have in their own lives, they have also struggled with expressions. So they are also writing on women's agency. They are also writing on how religion suppresses womanhood, etc., etc. So I think this was essentially a time. And let us also be, I mean, this is again a position, and I might be contested, but I'm willing to take the risk again, that this was also the time when literature was not commodified as much as it is commodified right now. So, I mean, when you have absolutely secondary, third-rate literature that is considered literature, now people might call me elitist, but I'm willing to take the risk. But now what we have in the name of literature is, I mean, it's just nonsense. I mean, that's not literature. I mean, let's be very clear that there are utterances that qualify as literary, and there are utterances that are not to be qualified as literary. So there is more commodification that has happened. The dictates of the market know no bounds. And there's a way in which this best-selling and number one bestseller, this seller, that award, all of that has gotten. So again, a very tentative, superficial kind of an engagement. So as I was saying earlier, that even in the context of literature, there is a superficiality. So these are novels that you could just finish in 2 hours, right? And there is hardly anything that you get out of it. It's just something that could have very well been written in 2 hours and therefore read in 2 hours. So, and on the other hand, and this is again not to take an elitist position, but say for instance, if one were reading Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, or if one were reading Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich, or if one were reading, I mean, I don't know, Bulgakov, whoever, great writers, or from India only, Amitav Ghosh, etc., then, it requires you to take a pause, to stop for a moment, to think, to go back, etc., etc., to ask yourselves whether you got it right or not. So literature also demands. Now, this freedom literature was essentially a result of a tempo, and this was also about a certain kind of realization. And this was also the time, as you would know way better than I do, this was also the time when art and politics were sort of brought together. So art for politics, as the progressives made a case for, the entire campaign was spearheaded. And nowadays, I don't think, I mean, neither art is art nor politics is politics. So even if we have art for politics, God knows what that is. So the fact of the matter is that we are actually operating in two different socio-political, cultural landscapes. So in the the period that you referred to, when some of the most extraordinary writers, Krishan Chand, Prem Chand, Sajjad Zahir, Faiz Ahmad Faiz, and others, Sahir, etc., were penning down the most illuminating reflections on the condition of the human existence. And then now you have, there's hardly credible, because I mean, why would I write a dense stuff? Nobody's interested in dense stuff. People are willing to read summaries. So if people are dying to read summaries, why on earth should I write? I mean, Shamsur-Rahman Farooqi ended up writing Mirror of Beauty, or Kai Chand The Taye Asma, and then of course the Mirror of Beauty, which is a fairly ambitious project. He's lucky that people ended up reading 1,000 pages. Otherwise, who reads 1,000 pages? Gone are the days. People would always say, one thing that I would want to read is War and Peace. And it remains want to read throughout the life, because it's 100,000 plus pages. So one thing that I would want to read is Anna Karenina, Great War for Civilization, Brothers Karamazov. But I mean, there are few people who take chances, and they also end up making a point. But for the most part, I think literature cannot be taken out of the social context. So these are the times.
You know, I also want to add to that now literature has been written by, I don't know, I don't understand. Why should a politician write literature in a textbook? Like, for example, I don't want to name, there is a Marathi minister who wrote a lesson in 8th standard textbook, Jeva Ghanta Vajto, when the bell rings. Now, Nida Fazli has written a beautiful poem, Bacche School Ja Rahe Hain. And if you read that poem, it has been translated into English. It's a part of a textbook. So you want to copy Nida Fazli. Now you want to copy Nida Fazli. You want to bring it into the textbook, because if say average there are 12 lakh children going to school, and if your chapter has been included in an 8th standard textbook, and if you get even 2 rupees per textbook, you get 24 lakh rupees a year for writing that book. So the main idea is commercial, as you said, commodification. It is not about writing. Jeva Ghanta Vajto, when the bell rings, it's a story of every person. You, me, I, the beggar on the street, the rickshaw puller, everybody has a story. When the bell rings at that point of time, how one would. And why do ministers have to have written Narasimha Rao's lesson? I have seen some other this thing. Isn't politics enough for you to pollute? You also come into the arena of education and you want to commodify it. So that's a problem, I believe. And I was not during the freedom fighter. I was not born then, but still you read the literature, you feel like standing up for your rights, you know. There is nothing in the pages and pages that I read that excites you to stand up for the right of yours. And sorry to say, you share the burden. I share a bigger burden, because I'm teacher's teacher. So I don't train my teachers enough to make them bold. They are so meek and docile that government ne keh diya ki sar ke bal chalna hai to chalna hai. They will not stand up and ask a question. And that is why there is no dialogue. It's monologue. One line advisory and everybody starts behaving like a clown without questioning. And if I question, I'm the most criticized person in the University of Mumbai. I care a damn about it. I'm not worried about it. But yes, you have to ask questions. You have to have dialogue. Why this? But nobody dares to. And I keep telling people, to kya hua meri naukri chali jayegi. So at the most kya? They will get me out of the job. Fine. I make very good food. I'll start a food business and I will earn money. I'm not scared about anybody in this world. So teachers don't have that kind of a stand. So that's why students are so meek and docile. And that percolates down when they grow up as an individual, and they don't even question the regime because they're so scared, because they never have a role model over there, you know. So that's the problem. It's a complete circle that starts with teacher, and I take the onus on me, and stops with teacher. If you don't teach them how to stand up for themselves, it will stop with teacher. And if you teach them how to stand up for themselves, it will start with teacher. Thank you very much, Dr. Irfanullah. That was very, very lovely dialogue engagement, I would say. Thank you.
Azad, I'll just take a minute. Sorry, can I just take a minute? This is not directly in relation to Professor Sabiha's comment, but this is, I mean, while she was speaking, it just struck me. I think one of the things that we can also think about, for instance, the gentleman before Professor Sabiha, when he talked about the unfortunate, event episode in the Parliament, I think what we also need to do is we should also not really isolate events. So for instance, something that has happened in the Parliament, it happens almost on a regular basis in our classrooms, right? Students are, there is a way in which students are trained in not speaking. I mean, if you want your students to speak, it might take a semester. And they shiver when they speak. And there are very often students tell you that to ask questions is to be disrespectful. This is Central Universities of India. Now, so there is, to me, I mean, if I have to, draw a line, I will draw it in no time. So there is no difference whatsoever between the professor, the teacher who's on the other side of the table in the classroom, claims to be a teacher, a pedagogue, and the person who has put the other leaders on mute. So it's essentially, there is a continuum, right? It's all the same. It's just that there is one frame which, I mean, we've been a part of that frame. As BA students, we've been part of that frame. We never thought about it, but suddenly in the Parliament, when it happens, then we say, oh, this is something that's unacceptable. But imagine if it had happened earlier while we were in the class, and had we thought about it at that point of time, perhaps the society would have been a little different, because then, thought also has this tendency to sort of, to create a certain kind of a vibrant atmosphere all around it. I mean, it leads to some kind of vibrancy around, but that didn't happen. So it happens all the time. In our families, it happens. In our circles, it happens. In schools, in classrooms, in universities, in meetings. So the chairperson is there, the faculty members will not speak. The vice chancellor is there, the deans will not speak. So of course, in the Parliament, the opposition is going to be put on mute. Why should that surprise us? That is not surprising at all, because what is happening in the Parliament is simply a reflection of what's happening across various walks of our lives in India. Yeah.
Right. I think Muhammad Baligh wants to ask or say something again. Baligh? Okay. And then we can go to Vishal. Baligh, do you want to say something? All right, Vishal Prasad.
Good evening, sir. Hello.
Hello.
I'm Vishal, and I'm from Jamia Millia, Islamia. Sir, I find your lecture very quite because you're talking in the part in democracy and in dialogue. You invoked a very critical idea, the idea of agency. So, sir, my question is related to that. Whenever dialogue is happening, on the questions of conflicts or any kind of dialogue, what I observed many a times that there is a denial of agency. Like if you take the question of Kashmir, so India and Pakistan are having a dialogue, but there is complete denial of agency to the Kashmiri people. Similarly, right now being associated with an anti-CAA movement coming from Jamia and being associated with that movement, one critical question that emerged from that movement was that Muslims in India have constantly been denied the agency. There was a much furor over the subject that why can't Muslims cannot lead the movement, why they are being denied the agency, to be a participant in the dialogue. So I find, so I would like to hear from your, I don't know whether it is a question or a comment, but yeah, I do find agency a very intriguing part for the democratization that you are talking about. So this is my question to you.
So the question, if I got it right, so the comments have to do with the anti-CAA movement, the whole anxiety around the question of Muslim agency in the movement. And the
Yes,
first
yes.
part was, I'm sorry, Kashmir. I mean, that was just an example.
So it could be, it could be both. It's specific to generic, generic to specific. You can take agency as an entire part of the procedure, and you can take this question also as a very the point of view of anti-CAA movement, or as you wish to.
Okay, okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Vishal. You see, I mean, as I said, that the question of agency, as I was saying earlier, that to Professor Sabiha's comment when I was responding to that, and in fact, in the course of my presentation as well, I categorically, I talked about it. That one of the fundamental issues is that democracy is always taken as a given, in the sense that we are a democracy, we cast our vote, we get our representatives in place, there are these sessions that take place, and there are bills and there are acts, etc., and everything is sort of heavenly. So this is essentially taken as a given. And also the problem is, and something that in a lovely, I mean, Gopal Krishna Gandhi is a gifted prose writer. He writes marvelous prose. So there was an editorial, there was an op-ed piece that he wrote in the Hindu when for Bhopal, Sadhvi Pragya was Sadhvi Pragya, I think, yeah, was declared as the candidate. So he talked, and the title, if I remember correctly, was The Ethics of Democracy. So the technicality, as I've been saying, the technicality of democracy will always be taken care of. But the ethics, the fundamentals of democracy as a practice, as a principle, have to do with making people more informed of their agency. And democracy of all the political expressions, democracy should not restrict my agency. That is the promise with which democracy entered the scene. So for instance, before democracy, if you think about, say, for instance, oligarchies or monarchies or aristocracies or any other form of government, one of the things that was sort of running common, or that sort of was to be found across these systems of government, systems of rule, was that people were denied their agency. And here is a system that said, you are going to rule. And if you are going to rule, it essentially means that you will be able to express your agency. Now, and democracy, therefore, is not, here we are constantly told about a democracy that is always insecure about its premise. Democracies are not meant to be insecure. Democracies, in fact, democracy's strength lies in its vulnerability, right? That it has to be vulnerable. If people pitch a democratic regime as a regime that will last for many decades, then it is not necessarily, in true sense, as I was saying earlier, a democratic regime. It is something else. Now, to come back to the agency question, I mean, I don't think I'm qualified to speak on the Kashmir issue, because I think it's much more complicated, and it's very, very nuanced, and the layers of the political history of the movement, of the issue, is something that I should not comment on. And more importantly, I'm also not well versed with the nuances. But one thing that is definitely that we can think about, and I think you passingly hinted at that, is that in dialogues that are of a superficial kind, in dialogues that are simply meant to formulate a certain policy and not really geared towards fusion of horizons, right? Some kind of new beginnings, what will always happen is that agency will be denied, right? So for instance, one thing that David Bohm points out in his essay on dialogue is that the fundamental problem with why we don't have dialogue, or we are not able to have dialogue, is we are always under the impression that we are listening, that we are already listening. right? So for instance, very often when the Kashmir issue comes up, or when the issue of the tribals comes up, or when the issue of the Dalits comes up, again and again, people on the other side say that we are listening, right? We are all ears. Now, this idea that we are already listening in itself is a blockade of sorts. And this becomes a position, this becomes a vantage point through which the agency of the other, the agency of the speaker is denied. So when you say we are already listening, and very often in our family conversations as well, I mean, so for instance, if you're asking your mother something and she has actually not listened to what you've said, and you say again and again, then after a while, frustrated, she'll say, "Arey bhai, I'm listening. Let's say this." How many times you would say, but you know it for a fact that she hasn't listened. So this idea that I'm already listening. Similarly, in democracy, we are already a democracy. What is it that you want? We are already a democracy. We are a functional democracy. We're a working democracy. So the question of, because the moment you give agency, this is also a pivotal moment. This is when things are going to change forever. So till the time, so for instance, Dalits, why is it that Dalits will not be given the kind of agency that they want? Because if they get the agency, then the entire political spectrum of Indian democracy will change. And we don't know what kind of a spectrum it will be. For instance, if tribals are given the agency, so we say there is going to be a dialogue between Vedanta and the tribal leadership. This is nonsense. I mean, you cannot have a dialogue between a corporate mafia and tribal people. I mean, what kind of a dialogue would it be? They will, I mean, the Vedanta will always have its say. And so, for instance, so Dalits will not be given the agency, Muslims will not be given the agency, the linguistic tribal minorities, ethnic minorities of the Northeast will not, because the day you give them agency, when you give them the mic, as it were, when you give them the mic, that is when things will essentially become very, very problematic. I'm reminded of a very interesting phrase, which is by the famous American Black author, James Baldwin. So James Baldwin, in one of his essays on victimhood, on racism and victimhood, he says that, and this is quite spot on in relation to the agency question that you've raised. He says that a victim remains a victim for as long as he does not or she does not articulate his victimhood. The moment he or she gets a language to articulate his or her victimhood, that is the day he or she ceases to be a victim. He or she becomes a threat, right? So from victim to threat. Take the example of Rohit Vemula, for instance. Rohit Vemula remained a victim for a very long time. But the day the man, the boy, the student, the gifted, aspirant of astrophysics, the day he began to articulate his victimhood, he began to talk about it and question it, that was the day that he became a threat to the entire system. Whether you call it the Hyderabad Central University or you call it the higher education landscape of India, he became a threat. So agency, so we are not very comfortable with passing on the mic, right? So the teachers might not be comfortable, as I was telling Professor Sabiha. Teachers might not be comfortable in passing on the mic to the students. If I give you as a student the agency, then something transformative will happen. I'm not willing to lose out on my privileges. And the simple another example could be of the example of empowerment. You cannot empower a minority, a marginalized community, without disempowering the other stakeholder. So it cannot work that the Dalit is empowered and the Brahmins remain as they are. It will not work that way. If you have to empower women, one way or another, men will have to compromise on or quit a bit on their privileges. So agency giving is also a problem. It's also an issue because I don't want to, give up on the many privileges that I have. So the day the day a Muslim gets an agency, is given an agency, or the Dalit is given an agency, then the entire equation changes. But democracy essentially wants that, because when a Dalit is speaking, he is speaking for me as well, right? In his speech lies my interest. This is something that democracy must train us in. When someone who is coming from a war affected or a conflict affected zone is speaking, he or she is speaking for me as well. right? In his speech lies my grievances too. I mean, I should associated mode of living, to go back to Ambedkar. That has not happened. So this is something that I can say, that this agency is therefore denied, because it is a pivotal moment, and the democracy, the way it works here, I don't think it's ready to entertain that, the arrival of that pivotal moment.
Yeah. Nitya Prakash now, I think she wants to ask a question.
Yes. Hi, sir. Thank you so much for your really insightful and such an erudite conceptual understanding of the notion of dialogue and democracy. So my question might sound very naive, but I'm also trying to just think through some thoughts, you know. So the first question or my own reflection is that we have already witnessed an attack of the democratic spaces in our country, especially when we see the institutions of university collapsing. And sir, I am from JNU, and I always felt that, you know, how JNU kept these spaces that got created, which became the site of knowledge and understanding. Like it was, you know, as informal as a dhaba, or, you know, within a classroom, or even on the dining table. Like it was a site of knowledge for us. And we could also develop this understanding through the language of politics, where we could find a connection to understand different notions of identity, different problems, and we picked up a language. So I personally feel that this creation of a space in order to make the dialogue very meaningful, and what you spoke of, that how dialogue has a transformative function, that something transforms within us. So I find myself, and along with you know, so many social scholars, I'm sure, like so powerless and helpless within this particular situation of the politics, where it feels like whatever we write is going into a vacuum, you know, with no impact, with no effect. And sir, linked to that is the second question, which might be very naive, because you know, in JNU also, when we talk about democracy, and there were parties which really upholded the progressive ideals of democracy. But why was it not that there was some kind of an association there? Like we didn't find any, you know, placement of Ambedkarite ideology, I think, till last 2 years. So there were so many ruptures which got appropriated by you know, what do you call, like very antagonistic politics, kind of a politics. So even in left, I kept wondering for time, why is there no unity? I'm talking about the, you know, left progressive front maybe, which got formulated so late in the nation. That why is ideology so important than the ethics and values of democracy? Because somewhere, that is how I felt the dialogues were so rigid somewhere, that we could not find a medium to connect. And that is a question which I still think that, you know, and I feel that is why today, is that why we are today in the position where the other opponents have really appropriated and used that division and differentiation of ideology to, you know, to make us see a day like this. Yeah, so that is what my question is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just, I'll start with the second one. The first one, I suppose, towards the end, I kind of, I mean, my memory is invariably an embarrassment. I might have missed the second half of the first question. I'll come back to that. But as far as the second question is concerned, I mean, JNU, of course, people who haven't lived, in fact, day scholars also don't understand JNU as much as, you know, hostelers do. In fact, only hostelers know what JNU is or what the JNU experience is about. I mean, JNU politics in itself remains a very mysterious kind of an affair. I mean, of course, I was there from 2004 to 2013, so I did my MA, MPhil, and PhD. And during those years, something very transformative was happening. So for instance, the conventional left, for instance, the SFI was losing its ground. and the ISA entered, so Mona Das and others. This was the time when you had a Nestle, Nestle's, what is it called, a cafe. And SFI unfortunately sided with the cafe being there, and ISA, spearheaded an entire campaign that we should not have Nestle on campus, and ISA won. And so we always had, but one thing that I suppose, I was never officially associated with any of these political wings or organizations, but I was very much an audience to all the public meetings, in all the public meetings. But one thing that I realized remained very, very problematic about JNU politics for a long time was that it was a patronizing politics. It was patronizing in the sense that whether it was SFI or ISA, and these were the two parties. Of course, the other was NSUI. NSUI only had few, ardent comrades here and there, and ABVP had its own, always had its own cadre. And now, of course, it's a booming party, as it were. But they always were patronizing every other identity. So everything was clubbed within the larger reference of class, right? But as we know that our lives are essentially messed up, right? Marginalization is such a messed up experience in itself. Even a Dalit will not be able to articulate his or her marginalization that eloquently. The Dalit will have to think about a lot of things because there's so much that the textures of marginalization or subjugation. But unfortunately, SFI did not attend to that. Of course, Ambedkar was there in few posters here and there, not even huge banners, just posters here and there, agitate, educate, organize, that's about it. And, you will have SFI, you will have ISA written there. So, of course, Ambedkar's fundamental position was related to caste, and JNU's mainstream politics was hardly interested in the question of caste or, for that matter, tribe. Although tribals have, JNU is a fantastic institution that way, that you get tribals from across country. In my class, we had tribals from Odisha, we had tribals from Rajasthan, and we had tribals from Northeast. So it's a fantastic setup in the admission policy. Of course, it's changed recently. So the politics was more of a patronizing kind. Now, as far as I am concerned, I don't see any problem in ideological differences. So for instance, if my political party has an ideological difference with your political party, although broadly we come under left, as far as student politics is concerned, I'm okay with it. In fact, now, and I think others can also pitch in their views, but now I think what has happened in JNU politics is quite unfortunate. It's unfortunate in the sense that although we are winning the elections, the student body elections, but at what cost? We are winning after an extraordinary compromise. So ISA and SFI people could not stand each other in terms of their political differences. But now they have no other option but to sort of join hands. AISF, SFI, ISA, DSU, whatever. Name it. They are all together now because this is the only way in which you can defeat ABVP. So it's a major compromise that has happened. So politics, I think, particularly student politics, I think as students, we should be aware. I think this is something that JNU does to a certain extent, but also failed considerably here and there, that we should know why we are voting for a particular party, right? So if I'm voting for BAPSA, I should know that why am I not voting for ISA? It's not just about voting for BAPSA or voting for DSU, but knowing more importantly, why is it that I'm not voting for NSUI? And this is an interesting grooming. So that difference is something that I like. To me, it's a wonderful thing. That confusion has to be there in the voter's mind. If a voter is not confused, then I don't think we are operating in a democracy. A voter has to have those moments of dilemma. So this is the first point. So the organized left is, people have written on this. The mainstream left has a very obnoxious position on various things, from politics to ideology to class to caste. And of course, sections that are emerging from grassroots who have affinities with the religion question, the caste question, the tribe question, they of course can't really gel well with these very, very orthodox positions. So I think that is something that's more of an obstacle, an impediment. So this is what I would say in relation to the second part. For the first part, I think what is also important is, as far as our understanding of politics is concerned, JNU also, and this is the irony of JNU as a campus, as a university, JNU also creates a false consciousness, right? I mean, it creates a false consciousness in the sense that while we are living in hostels, we are reading these pamphlets, we think that, good Lord, India is such a ridiculously educated, literate, politically articulate society. You step out of the North Gate and the world changes. It's a different continent altogether. You're galaxies away from what's happening inside JNU. So JNU also creates this in a very subtle way, a false consciousness, right? That we are seldom able to think that there's a world outside JNU. And only when you get out of JNU, you realize that the world outside is way more brutal as compared to the ABVP people who are inside JNU, right? Or the SFI people, any of your political opponents. So it creates shall I say, that bubble, right? And I think that is something that student politics take us beyond. Although JNU happens to be one of the first institutions always to take lead in various, as far as various issues are concerned, whether it's CC or stuff or higher education policy, whatever. JNU is always, in a certain sense, taking the lead. Yet at the same time, it's very unfortunate that JNU is not able to inform its students of about the world outside. So we remain very much implicated in a very immediate, and of course these mess discussions, the dhaba discussions, there's something extraordinarily romantic about it, right? I mean, we are always basking in the glory of ideas, but the fact of the matter is, if we are not able to, and this is something that many cab drivers have told me, that JNU students don't know how to talk. Now, this is a fantastic critique, a rebuttal from the subaltern classes. I mean, who can talk if JNU students can't talk? I mean, I thought they were the best of all the orators, but turns out they can't talk to an Ola cab driver. Now, if we can't learn that, if we are going to Sarojini Market from Northgate, you've taken an auto, and if you can't speak for the auto wala for 10 minutes, then I'm afraid reading of Capital Volume 1, 2, and 3 is absolutely down the drains. It's useless, right? I mean, of course, the luminaries of mainstream Marxism will hate me for this, but it is absolutely useless. So I think JNU in that sense has kind of failed. We couldn't really come up with that language, right, where we could just speak to people. And this is something that universities must do. Universities have to have that barrier from the society, which is to say that we will do everything in the university that the society does not let you do. So in the university, intercaste marriages can take place. In the university, people from different religions can fall in love. In the university, homosexuals will express their identity. Outside the university, of course, they will be lynched, etc., etc. So university will guarantee you every possible liberty. But at the same time, university would want you to take that take that outside the confines, the boundaries of the campus. This is something that, unfortunately, I suppose JNU. I mean, of course, it did rather well as compared to other universities, but I guess it's somewhat lacking as far as that particular bit is concerned. This is what I would say. I don't know if I addressed the first question or not, but I guess tentatively this is where it goes.
Right. Anas Saidalvi now.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes, Anas.
So my name is Anas. I'm doing my master's in international relations at JNU.
Okay.
My question is, so there is an apprehension that India is shifting towards a majoritarian rule. So how much we can manifest the dialogue in our efforts to ensure the political representation for the underprivileged in the Indian context? And now because the dialogue is not going to happen sometimes, because there is a pre-assumption that they are not going to agree with us. So anyone is not going to pay heed for your voices. So how we can inculcate the essence of the dialogue in ensuring our political rights, as you said, the democracy of the sense of association as the mode of living that is the concern for others. So that is not going to happen because nobody is going to pay heed for your voices, your arguments. So if you speak for your right, you are framed as an antagonistic for the regime or ruling party. And you said that to come out of the identity, you said that you should come out of your identity to have the dialogue. So can we think that if dialogue is possible with much adherence to the identity? So I mean that without shedding the layers of our identity, as we know, the Holocaust and the Hitler, they were the product of the liberal democracy, but there was no much such sense of the association mode of living. In answer to your question, he also said the negation of the agency and the articulation of the victimhood. So is the disempowerment of the privileged people, so is it possible only with a dialogue rather than the political action?
Okay, is that all?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify one thing. Maybe you got that, maybe you didn't get that. When I said that democracy ultimately wants us to raise ourselves above our identities or identity claims, what I also said alongside was that I'm not talking about marginalized identities, right? So Dalits are not expected to go beyond their identities. Democracy wants them to be Dalits and make their claims as Dalits. But we are essentially talking about the privileged, right? The powerful, the privileged, the haves, etc., etc. But to come back to the question, I mean, I honestly don't know how do we take this forward. But for instance, this question that you have about dialogue and how is it possible that we can have a dialogue, I think there has to be a way in which democracy's connection or democracy's very hopeless connection with numbers needs to be severed. We have to do something about it. And one thing is, I mean, I'll just go back to, because the student before, prior to you, she spoke about JNU. I'll just give a quick example. I think we need to also ask ourselves, what kind of activism do we promote? Right? What kind of activism do we promote? So let's say I'm just giving an example. So let's say we are doing an event on the CAA, the anti-CAA movement. So let's say there's a program that we want to organize, an event that we want to conduct on Citizenship Amendment Act, right? Now, what is it that we have in mind as we are thinking about conducting that program? This is a very important question. And I'm saying this because something happened along these lines, and I'll come to that in a bit. So for instance, if our poster is of a kind that only appeals to those who are against the CAA, then I think we have failed, and failed miserably, right? Because if I want you to be my audience, now you are already against the Citizenship Amendment Act. I am speaking against Citizenship Amendment Act. You are listening to someone who's saying exactly things that you know. Now, where does that take us? What difference does it make as far as the everyday workings of democratic aspirations are concerned? Now, let's say if the event is conducted in a way that few people who are not convinced about the anti-CAA movement, but also have doubts about the CAA development, if they also become a part of the assembly, if they also become a part of the audience, then I think we have done something. Of course, there's nothing revolutionary about it, but there is something that has happened. I think what usually happens in the case of activism is that we are operating within the same life world, so it's not really a dialogue. So for instance, I mean, I am not demeaning what happens at Jantar Mantar, or I am not demeaning what happens at Mandi House, or at various squares, as it were, of the country. But what I'm pointing out is that if everyone who is going there is convinced that this is an inhuman law, then it doesn't really make any difference. 3,000 people are there in the rally. everyone thinks that the CAA is unacceptable, that we need to repeal the act, etc., etc., it doesn't really make any difference. We should do it in a way, or we should try and reach out to people who think that there's nothing wrong with CAA, or at least those who are somewhere in between. At least we should start with that. And I'll give you the example. The example is to do with Delhi riots. So when Delhi riots took place, of course, a lot of people have written that it wasn't, I mean, you don't call it riots. Irfan Ahmad wrote on it that you don't call it riots, you actually call it a pogrom, because it was a pogrom, right? So now the point is that, let's say you have to, now you want to have a program on this, you want to conduct an event. Now, how are you going to design a poster that categorically says not a riot, not a clash, a pogrom, and in red and black and whatnot? I'm not questioning the sincerity here. This is absolutely the truth. But you paste these posters across the university campus. Now, who do you think will come for this? Right? Of course, those who genuinely think that, yes, it was a pogrom. Now, why on earth should we talk to the people who are already aware of the fact that it's a pogrom? What's the point? Why spend 2 hours talking to 25 odd people who already know what you are going to talk about, right? This is something that has plagued activism. We have forgotten to go beyond the convenient nooks and corners of activism. And this is something that we need to learn from classrooms. I think classrooms teach us the dynamics of activism. If a classroom is open to deliberative discussions and open dialogues, then I think in due course, we will also be able to do something in our broader role as activists. So, which is why dialogue is not happening. So at the moment, what is happening is the majoritarian, for instance, what you pointed out, that India, of course, is heading towards a majoritarian democracy. It is actually a majoritarian democracy. But what we also need to understand is that it has gradually become a majoritarian democracy. And there is nothing that we have done in order to counter that development, as far as in our own capacities as learners, teachers, activists, or sentient citizens of the country. So we have very much, so that dialogue, of course, will happen much later. But my position is that in our, modest endeavors, how often do we try to cross the boundary, as it were? We don't, right? Our events are conducted in a way, the posters of the events are made in a way that so when I was invited for the JNU event, and I told the organizers that let's not do it this way. I mean, in a place like JNU, 25 people were there for the Delhi riots event, discussion. Only 25 students. It's not even tragic. It's beyond that. In a place like JNU, you're talking about something that has happened in the heart of the capital of the country, and only 25 students are there, right? That's not tragic. That's something much more than that. Why is that? Because the organizers were hell-bent upon pitching it a certain way. There's nothing wrong with that. Go ahead. But then don't expect 2,000 people to show up, right? So only those people will be there who are part of the organizing committee, who are part of the platform that is organizing the event. That's it. No one else. People are just passing by. No one gives a damn how many people died. There were survivors. Nobody gives a damn, because there's a way in which it is publicized. So I think on the one hand, of course, the issue remains crucial. But I think we must also, and this is something that's being said again and again in universities, and particularly intellectuals, academicians are targeted for this, that we must come up with a language that is the language of, to borrow from the extraordinary Italian sociologist, writer, Gramsci, organic intellectuals. We have to have that vocabulary, as a result of which we can speak and get something from those who are neither there nor here. I'm not talking about the extreme right. That's one heck of an ambitious task to do, right? Somebody like Gandhi could, embark on that journey. I don't think any of us lesser mortals could do that. But there is a substantial chunk that is confused. That's neither there nor here. You talk to them, they figure out, okay, there is some possibility to read this. Someone else talks to them, they go there. This is a chunk that is still there. And it can very well decide the fate of Indian democracy in the years to come. But so far, as far as the intellectuals are concerned, the civil society activists are concerned, we are busy with our own. I mean, we take pride in the fact that we talk and people listen to us and they appreciate, etc., etc. But end of the day, what difference does it make? Unless it is, so the majoritarian tinge that we are seeing in democracy can only be countered if those who are on the other side of the debate, those who are on the other side of the table, evolve a certain language, as a result of which there could be more addition. And believe me, the day the equation changed, why is it that the government did not give a damn to the anti-CA protest? Because there was not even a single individual that they could sense was their voter. The day you get their voter on the road, it's over. They have no, I mean, this is the way in which it works. So a regime, any political party, not just the government, any political party is genuinely interested in consolidating, maintaining its voter base. So I don't vote for the regime. I'm speaking against the regime. The regime does not give a damn. I mean, I might as well die or, what is it called? Self-immolate myself too. Who cares, right? But if there are people who are identified voters of the regime, and then they begin to articulate this grammar of protest, that is when I think things will, because that's where the maths gets disturbed. And this is where you begin to then make this case that democracy is not crass mathematics. Democracy is more than that people are able to see beyond their immediate identity. So I might be from religion B, but I am concerned about individuals belonging to religion A. I might be from caste A, but I am concerned about grievances of caste C and D. This is something that unfortunately our democracy has not managed to achieve, and which is why it's increasingly becoming more and more majoritarian as we speak.
Sir, you said about the empowerment of the underprivileged and the disempower of the privileged. So could you elaborate it more?
Oh, so what I was saying was, I'll just give a quick example. So let's say we talk about women's empowerment, right? Now the point is, I mean, power, how should I, so for instance, if I have to, so let's say if I have to give you power, I have to empower you. How do I give you power? I don't necessarily get power from Iran. I mean, it's somewhere in the Indian society. So and the reason why you don't have enough power or you're marginalized is to do with the fact that there is another section that has more share of power. So I will have no other option but to take power from that section and give it to you. In other words, there is no way you can empower women without taking privileges from men. It's impossible to think of a process where women get empowered and men do not have to quit on their privileges. No, that's not going to happen. Men will have to give up on their privileges. Only then women will be empowered, which is why every time we make a case for empowerment, you have people speaking against it. So every time we have case for women's empowerment, you have all those who have stakes in patriarchy. They will speak against it. Every time you talk about students' empowerment, people who have stakes in the larger higher education landscape, they will speak against it. Because when students get empowered, the other side of the table will have to lose out on its privileges, right? If the minority gets empowered, the majority will have to lose out on its privileges, and so on and so forth. You can just formulate any example on the basis of this particular formula. So unless, and I am not willing to, as a man, I'm not willing to give up on my privileges. So this is why the issue remains. And more importantly, I'm not willing to identify with the fact that a woman's empowerment is my empowerment. This is something that democracy has failed to educate me about. That a minority's empowerment is my empowerment. A Dalit's empowerment is, for me, Dalit's empowerment is Dalit empowerment. Urdu language's promotion is the promotion of Urdu language. I do not see this as the promotion of a language that happens to be in the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution. Right? So I'm still seeing issues in a very fragmented way. Women, tribal, Muslim, Northeast, Kashmir, Dalit, people with disability, etc., etc. But the point is, if the lower rungs of the society get empowered, of course the society gets empowered. But democracy unfortunately failed, or those who've been at the helm of affairs for decades now, they miserably failed in educating us about that. A very fundamental lesson that we get to know while we discuss things about politics and power in undergraduate years.
Sir, you said that your journey experience
Anas,
that,
you can Anas, let others also ask questions.
Okay.
We have at least two
Yeah,
people.
Behzad, I just want to put a request on record. I might want to leave in about 5 to 10 minutes because my daughter,
Okay.
she has, I help her with her cycling. And this morning only, she asked my wife to find another husband. So if I don't take her to cycling, then I think things might get a little serious. So 10 more minutes before my family is, all over the place. Okay, please go ahead. Sorry.
So there are two people, Urusa Mushtaq and Mushtaq Sikandar. Both of them can ask questions in sequence, and then you can ask both together. So Urusa first.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. It's always a delight. Even when I was in SAU, I always wanted to be in your class, but I was in another department, so I didn't have the good fortune. But like as you were speaking, there were so many things that were coming to me, and I really cannot articulate all of them. But just a couple of things which I can remember so far is that I had a very brief stint in JNU. I was there for just about 6 months. I joined in July 2019.
MPhil program.
Yeah, I joined for an MPhil program in July 2019, and I believe the time I came into JNU it was one of the most tumultuous times for me personally, because just 2 weeks later the abrogation of 370 happened, and then everything just went down south after that. Immediately JMI happened, the CA happened. So I think the thing that you mentioned about JNU being a utopia of sorts, people are in a bubble, they don't know what's going on the outside, and they just think that, oh, we're talking to each other and it's hunky-dory everywhere. Well, it's not so. But I think now it's honestly not a utopia anymore, because I was there during the anti-CAA protests. I was there during the abrogation. I was there on the night of the JNU attack. I was there the entire, it was a very horrible time to be there. People actually, there are no safe spaces for you to talk anymore. I was personally intimidated by the women wing of a certain organization, which I do not think I should name. People know what I'm talking about. So I do not think that there is a utopia anymore that exists in JNU. I think it has transcended that. Even with the JNU SU elections that happened, and the left, as you said, they had to leave aside their ideologies and form a united left to be able to defeat ABVP, because that is how strong ABVP had gotten, and which ended up eventually, BAPSA ended up losing votes. But anyhow, my question was that what came to my mind after that was, since you also spoke about a mode of association, that for us to be able to do something, we need to associate. But upon whom does this, I don't know if burden is the term I should be using, this burden of association fall? Because what I saw were very pronounced identities. I faced it because I was a Kashmiri. Someone faced it because he was a Muslim. Right now, whatever is happening is because of their identities. And that's funny, they do not even subscribe to those identities. Because if Umar Khalid's case is seen, he is very, even when I've heard him speak on the campus, he's very blatant about the fact that, listen, I'm an atheist, I don't know, I'm not a Muslim. And my name might be Umar Khalid, which again, I find very funny, his name. But according to what he says, he does not subscribe to that identity. Who takes the burden of that association? And how can we disassociate from our identities when that identity is the very premise upon which that association is sought? How is that disassociation possible? And is it for us to give a certain time frame to each identity to come out of that phase where there is an immediate association, to come into a phase where you might have a certain window to disassociate, or just immediately jump into it? Is it even possible to jump into it? I'm not sure if I've been able to get across
No,
my
it's
question.
absolutely fine. No, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
And Mushtaq Sikandar.
Thank you, Dr. Farooqi, for your very nice presentation. I just have one question regarding literature, particularly in the vernacular Urdu. We witnessed that during the progressive writers movement, the Taraqi Pasand Urdu
Tehreek.
Tehreek. Yeah, so the writers were writing, and was it that they were trying to create a new kind of world? And after the advent of postmodernism and, in a certain sense, a triumph of capitalism, that we don't witness that kind of in Urdu, that's the Miyari adab, or the adab that basically has some message to it. Did postmodernism change that kind of thinking? And also, particularly because I belong to a conflict region of Kashmir. In Kashmir, also, there are many writers in Urdu, vernacular Urdu, and Kashmiri writing, but nobody has documented the nuances of the conflict, like we witness the conflict literature coming from Palestine and Ireland and other such places. The Kashmiri literature, particularly in the vernacular Urdu and Kashmiri, is very rare. Is it because the state is so much strong, or that utopia, or what the intellectuals and writers are supposed as a responsibility to write? Have they just given up that kind of thing? So these were my two questions.
Okay, thank you, Mushtaq. I'll request you to just repeat the first question. You asked about vernacular literature, that the progressive writers were trying to create a new trend.
Yes.
And then you talked about
postmodernism.
Yeah.
Then postmodern, did it change that that there is no meaning, everything is subject to, and we don't, because also there was demise of communism in a certain sense.
Yes.
And
so you were essentially asking this question related to Mayari Adab, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great. I'll be quick. Again, I mean, I think these are, you see, these are questions that are very, that are straight out of our, you know, our lived experiences, and these are deep concerns and inquiries. But of course, as far as the formalities go, I'll try and address these questions. So in relation to Urusa's question, yes, I'm grateful to you for you know, checking me in my tracks, as it were. But of course, on the one hand, I do agree with you that back in the day when I was in JNU, things were very different. And of course, there's a lot of stuff that has happened. There is, in true sense, quote unquote, an awakening that has happened. And there's no denying that position. I think you're absolutely right that things have changed, and changed substantially, significantly. And there's a certain kind of identity politics, a very, very, very dynamic, fruitful, and democratically charged identity politics and identity informed assertion that we see now in JNU politics. There is fraternity movement. There are other, you know, factions here and there that are trying to constantly, at least round the year. Of course, during the election, the things are a little different, but round the year, they're trying to contest the hegemonic position of the left across campus politics spectrum. But I would say that while there is a certain truth in your assertion, I would still want to point out that, you know, I mean, even if you don't call it a bubble, or even if you don't say that there is a certain kind of false consciousness that kind of grips or captivates the imagination of JNU students or JNU community, I would nonetheless want to point out that, you know, I mean, think about, because you talked about it, think about the night, you know, JNU students were attacked, right? So you have these goons entering from all sides of the campus. And of course, there was a message that was circulated, and we rushed, and so many, you know, friends from even SAU, a lot of people were there. I met a few students there, colleagues from SAU, one or two, of course. So people essentially ran from, so somebody came from CR Park. There were few people who had come from Jaipur to Delhi. They got to know, they came. There were few who had come from, and they were not even students of JNU. They just came in solidarity. But when I was standing there, one thing that I was thinking repeatedly, and it was a very scary moment, by the way. In the beginning, people were not, because my sister-in-law was there, and she was almost surrounded by you know, goons. And she had to be rescued by an NDTV journalist also got beaten. So it was a bit scary in the beginning, and people were not really right outside the North Gate. They were in front of the Paschimabad gate. And from there, they actually walked all the way to the North Gate. So all of us walked. Now, one thing that I was thinking throughout that night, we were there till 4 in the morning. One thing that I was thinking again and again was that not even a single individual from Munirka came. Now, Munirka is across the North Gate, right? So there has to be, I mean, I'm not saying that, I mean, I don't know. I just fail to understand that, you know, people from Okhla are coming, people from Aligarh have come, people from CR Park, Shadra, you know, ITO, Old Delhi, even many NTCA protesters also came because JNU played a very, very important role in that entire agitation. People were coming from all nooks and corners of the city. And eventually it was a huge gathering around 2 o'clock in the morning. There were roughly about, you know, 3,000 people across. But not even, you know, few from Munirka. I mean, even if there were people from Munirka, these were JNU students, ex-JNU students. Let's be very clear about it. So I think while a lot of new developments have happened inside the campus, my concern is, and I think our concern should be, that this did not really find an audience outside, immediately outside the campus. This, I suppose, is something that the JNU community, of course, I will also have to think about it. I can't really absolve myself of that. I think that there is something missing in our activism, because if we are getting beaten up badly by goons, and if we can't get immediate, I mean, people from immediate neighborhood, then I think something has happened, right? Something is missing. So this is something that I wanted to, I mean, this is something that I still think about. While I completely agree with you that it need not be considered a utopia of the kind that it was back in the day when I was there as a student. But I would nonetheless want to pitch this, that there's still something that's missing, that dynamic politics, although ridiculously extraordinary, but has somehow again failed to find an audience outside, right? So students are still running, they're still running for their lives, etc. And that's very unfortunate that we don't have, you know, I mean, for instance, if, I mean, I don't know, when Jamia was happening, you know, exactly something of that sort didn't happen, but as a result of police high-handedness, you know, a lot of people from Jamia Nagar, so Jamia has a very different relationship with Jamia Nagar as a result of cultural, historical reasons. But I suppose here and there, I think we can think about why JNU failed to make that connection. In relation to the burden of association, I think it's a very important question. I think there's been a certain, I mean, I've been trying to clarify again and again. I didn't mean to, and I think it will be a sin on my part, a reprehensible crime, to say that those who are marginalized need to dissociate themselves from their identity. Of course not. As I was saying earlier to this friend from Kerala who was asking the question earlier, that in fact, democracy wants me to claim my identity as a Muslim, as a Dalit, as a woman, right? As a Kashmiri, for that matter. Now, so the burden of association is on those who are privileged. Who gets, I mean, Dalits would always want to associate themselves with the Brahmins. Where is the problem? The problem lies with the Brahmins, right? So the marginalized would always want to, you know, extend a hand. I don't think marginalized are hell-bent upon, you know, a reversal of fascism, not at all. The marginalized are always willing to sort of, you know, take a step forward. But it is the not so marginalized, it's the privileged who will always have issues with coming forward, with going beyond. So the dissociation is expected from those who are privileged, not the marginalized. Democracy is expecting the Brahmin to do away with his privileges, to think beyond his Brahmanical identity. Democracy wants the privileged majoritarian community, because if, and the simple example is, if the majority community does not think above itself, you cannot rescue Indian democracy. Indian democracy is done and dusted. We cannot do anything about Indian democracy. It is the majority community that will have to think above its immediate identity. And only then can everything, you know, shady that's carried out in the name of democracy can be checked in its tracks. So We are not supposed to dissociate ourselves from identities. They happen to be our reservoir. They are our source of conviction, right? So a Dalit is not required to do away with his Dalit identity, her Dalit identity. A woman, a Kashmiri, a Muslim, a person from the Northeast, a person from a tribal background, etc., etc. So the burden of association is, or let's say the responsibility, I'm also not phrasing it a certain way, the responsibility lies on those who are powerful in terms of numbers, right? So those who are majority, those who sort of call the shots, as it were, the privileged, the elite, the not gifted, sorry, the haves, as it were. So these are the people on whom lies the responsibility of coming up with this, initiating what Ambedkar called an associated mode of living, right? So this is something, so I'm once again making it very clear that I did not mean to say, in fact, I think I did say this, although I don't exactly recollect, but I did say this, that I don't mean to say that marginalized identities need to do away with their identity claims. In relation to Mushtaq's question, I mean, I would say that, there are various ways in which postmodernism has been looked at from, scholars working on literature. And Urdu literature, of course, has a very different, it was a little late in responding, but people like Shamsur-Rahman Farooqi, Gopi Chand Narag and others have responded to this whole, development. See, one thing that is very clear is, although postmodernism is a fairly, it's a very cool thing, and people take pride in, citing Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard and who not. But one thing that postmodernism refuses to acknowledge is that as human beings, we always need a certain, what should I say, a certain basis of our existence, right? There's a wonderful book by Zygmunt Bauman. It's called Intimations of Postmodernity. And in that, Bauman has actually critiqued, in a certain sense, the postmodern assertion that there are no grand narratives, that there is no universal truth. What Bauman is essentially pointing out is that, and I think in the case of literature as well, this is something that is important, that this multiplicity can be expressed, but you will always operate from a certain position. The subject position cannot be denied its due. For instance, to go back to Urusa's question, identity politics stands in the face of postmodernism. If you look at Edward Said's issues with postmodernism, one thing that Edward Said was repeatedly insisting on, and people like Foucault and others could not respond to that, was how do you look at the whole identity politics question? For instance, Foucault could not respond to Palestinian liberation movement. I mean, how does a postmodern thinker or a postmodernist reflect on these extraordinary moments of identity informed assertions, right? Whether it's the mosque movement or it's the Palestinian liberation movement or it's the Kashmir movement or any tribal assertion. So identities are important. So there is a certain corpus that we always want to hold on to. Now, at times, as a result of politics of knowledge and episteme, it could become a meta grand narrative. But for the most part, these remain multiple, these remain contesting narratives. So in the case of literature as well, postmodernism did bring in a certain things a little later, of course. So for instance, questions related to multiplicity of experience, questions related to diasporic experience. These were things that were brought in Urdu literature. In fact, people like Quratullah and Haider, sorry, not Quratullah and Haider, people like Ismat Chokhtai also at some point in time started writing about, a woman who's actually settled abroad. So womanhood or gendered experience was also looked at from the vantage point of diaspora, migration, etc. So postmodernism did bring in a certain shift, but I think it was a phenomenal shift, because I think modernism, the claimants of modernism, Jadidiyat, the icon, of course, is Shamsur-Rahman Farooqi. I think that proposition remains more powerful in the context of Urdu literature of the times we live in. Lastly, in relation to Kashmir, when you talked about the literature in Kashmir, of course, I am as ignorant as a stone when it comes to this. But given what you said, I would say that literature always has a certain degree of self-censorship, and particularly literature of marginality. So usually there is self-censorship, and once in a while there is a disguised expression as well. So only someone who is raised in Kashmir, might be able to read between the lines. If I were to read in translation, I might not get it. But there are ways in which expressions of marginality find their way in literary texts. So of course, on the face of it, it might be a simple story. I'm just sort of, as it were, these are shots in the air. But on the face of it, it might be a simple narrative, very sequential and adhering to the linear sequence of time, etc. But maybe those who are aware of the Kashmiri experience might be able to read it somewhere. And it might also be the case that, my mother is able to read between the lines more than I am able to. Although I'm trained in reading and whatnot, I've done courses on reading, writing, and whatever, thinking. But my mother, because there is a certain nuance that's there as a result of few words here and there that she's able to get, right? There is an exchange. But in general, literatures also, indulge in self-censorship. Adorno famously wrote when he was talking about, when he was contributing to Marxist literary criticism, one thing that he said was that as critics, we should not be interested in what the literature says or what the text says, but what the text hides. So actually, this brings me to the final point, that the fact that they are not writing about it itself is an expression. And it's a phenomenal expression. It's almost like a blank editorial, right? At the time of emergency, remember Statesman, blank page. And recently, I think some Hindi daily or some Rajasthan daily also carried out a blank page as a result of the high-handedness of the regime. So because I'm not writing about it, that also tells that you have reached or you have subjugated me to the extent that I don't even feel like writing about the subjugation. Now, that's a completely different chapter or a completely different expression of a violent suffering, right? So for instance, when we talk about, silent mothers, right? So, our mothers hardly speak about what they go through. This is the epitome of violence or suffering. So this is another thing that I can think of. But of course, because I'm not from the valley, these are just, preliminary remarks. And I'm willing to be humbled by being told that this is not the right diagnosis. But this is usually the way in which literature of marginality or literature reflective on suffering works, that you don't talk about the issue. And as you don't talk about the issue gains a certain prominence. It gets highlighted. So,
all right, Dr. Farooqi, thank you very much. I'm sure everybody will agree with me in saying that you brilliantly engaged the topic dialogue and democracy today. Thank you very much again for joining.